Oh, ladies and gentlemen, today is May the 1st, 2022, and it's a lovely cloudy day here in Seattle. Take a seat, find a seat, because we are going to discuss the world. Maybe you have an opinion, maybe you have a question, maybe you just want to listen in, maybe you want to leave now. All of these things are fine. As we begin another episode of World Discussion with Agent Smith. Agent Smith. Smith.
How are you doing?
Pretty good. What about yourself?
Can't complain. I met your challenge today, so that was at least taken care of.
He did the walk! For people who didn't hear last time, I challenged our lovely Agent Smith to a 20-minute walk, which he conquered like a boss. Do you feel like a boss now that you've walked for 20 minutes?
I'll probably feel more like a boss if I hadn't eaten a pizza afterwards.
That's what we call one step forward and two steps back.
Pretty much.
Dude, I had pizza. I ordered it on Thursday because I was like, man, I haven't treated myself in a while. I'm going to order a pizza. And man, the inflammation I get from having that much cheese is crazy. My back hurt on Friday and Saturday. I was just like stiff and ouch and ugh. And I was asking Chad, I was like, do you guys feel like inflammation after having pizza? And they were like, yes, sir, it is known that you feel like shit for several days after having a full pizza. Okay.
Definitely weighs on you.
But let it be known that in the future, I will make the same mistake again.
It's really good. It always brings you back.
Yep. Well, I had a pretty good week. Today has been a crazy stream. I've had the most jagged difference in opinions on my beard that I've ever had. I started the stream and someone was like, Neuro, you look beautiful today. Neuro, your beard is really filling out nice. And then someone said that I look like a pedo. And I was like, what? And then they said nothing else. That's all they said. And then there was someone else who said, your face looks terrible and the beard is awful and it looks like neck pubes. And I was like, isn't that what facial hair is? It's pubic hair. Post-puberty. That's when it happens. And then they started defending it as all people in Ireland have thick skin and this is normal for them. And I was like, man, what a way to shift the reputation of the Irish by setting this horrible example. So it's been interesting. We were talking about maybe just shaving half of the face so we can please the beard crowd and the anti-beards, and then just have two separate cameras and they can put a sticky note over which one they don't like.
Wow.
It could work until I go outside and then people are aghast, wondering what happened to me. But that's one of the interesting things about being a live streamer who has a camera on, is you put yourself out there, and beauty is subjective to an extent, and people are very keen to just share their opinions on whether they think that you look good or not. You can even wake up and feel pretty good about yourself and then just immediately get bashed as soon as you turn the camera on. It's exciting.
I guess that's just the nature of the internet for you, huh?
It is. It's a safe place too, where I think people can experiment with certain types of comments that they wouldn't say in real life, but they feel a higher level of safety and a lower level of repercussions for saying that kind of stuff. So they're like, let me just test the waters. Maybe they've thought out in the wild, in the world, that they don't really like the way that beards look, and they're just not a fan. And they find someone who is bearded, who cannot challenge them in person, and they can just let those comments out there. So I think of that as an interesting foray into human psychology of what people are willing to say on the internet.
Well, anonymity definitely has an impact.
It does.
Whether it's a good impact or not is debatable.
There is a negativity bias that I try to be aware of, which is if you get 3 good comments and then 3 bad comments, you generally feel more bad than you feel good.
Mm-hmm.
The bad comments tend to stick with you and haunt you a little bit, and that's just a normal human tendency.
Hmm.
The vast, vast majority of the chat is very respectful and well behaved. So thank you, Chad. But yeah,
Anything else exciting happened this week?
uh we had our D&D campaign, and all three of our characters ended the episode unconscious. So it's a bit of a yikes. We're kind of just sweating until the next episode and we find out what is going to become of our team. We fought against a creature which more or less outclassed us. It had some nasty effects of being super strong and very resistant to physical damage, and then it also had this aura of darkness around it, which made us have a blindness penalty where we could not really see it very well, so our accuracy was greatly diminished. We're not quite sure if this is a good character or a bad character, but we found them chained up and they were like trying to cast mind control stuff on us, so all the signs pointed to them being a villain, but we're not quite sure. We're not fully dead yet, but we're definitely in a very bad spot. So that happened. I've been playing a lot of Dota 2, which has been really fun. That game is super toxic. Holy guacamole. I've been joking about like a Dota survival guide and how a lot of people, they just take the approach of it's a 5v5 game, and if you die for any reason, instead of thinking about, was I out of position? Did I make a mistake here? You just go to the minimap and start pinging your allies, and then just say in the chat, bro, what the fuck? And you just like start blaming one person in particular. And that's a way of just taking that pressure off of, oh my gosh, I just let down my team. I made a mistake, and I need to be more mindful of that moving forward and think about my moves. They'll just like full on pick a scapegoat and just ride them the whole game. You can't really do that to the same extent in StarCraft. The main thing that you can do in SC2 is either blame balance or blame their strategy being one that shouldn't work. That's one that some people in StarCraft do. But the Dota community is really mean. It's like an environment of hazing. You go into the match, and they want to be so mean to you that they can increase their ranking by getting you to retire from the game.
Sounds like a typical MOBA.
Yeah, for sure. I played Han, though, so a lot of the comments I'm not really surprised by. There was one that made me laugh just because it involved some brain science. I was playing the carry, and we're winning the game. The enemy team is now on the back foot, and their base is getting destroyed. And the mid of the enemy team said that our carry's frontal lobe is made of mac and cheese. Which is an insult, but it's a very specific brain region insult. So the cognitive scientist part of me was like, oh, they know one of the areas of the brain. That's awesome. It's kind of mean, but at least they were a little bit creative with it.
Yeah. That's something to be gotten out of it anyway.
Yeah. I sometimes forget that the StarCraft community is like way more respectful than average, and then I go out into Dota 2 and I say, ah, yes, the crusty underbelly of the internet.
Yeah, unfortunately, the more popular a game is, the more you get a gamer base that's, shall we say, representative of the internet as a whole.
Yeah. I think there are a lot of nice internet users out there, but the culture for something that's competitive and involves other people impacting your own rank, it can breed a lot of resentment for other people because they'll feel like they're not in a bad station because of themselves, but it's because other people keep messing up things for them.
Yeah. Yeah, mindfulness is a skill.
Yeah.
It has to be learned and practiced.
Then in the wider world, yeah, I was ready for that question. The Texas border being closed and all the trucks and stuff being checked. I don't know if we talked about that last time.
No, we were talking about other stuff, so kind of flew under my radar.
Yeah, did you look into that at all or hear about that?
Yeah, I mean, it was basically just the Texas state government doing a little grandstanding, as they are apt to do. there was a rule implemented by the U.S. government. I don't remember which agency it was specifically, but basically the rule involved the deportation, the immediate deportation of people who were trying to seek asylum. And it was justified on the grounds of COVID-19.
Mm.
They were concerned that maybe people coming in might spread the virus. And so, using that as justification, the government had been basically just deporting the vast majority of people that had been trying to cross the border. And that was ended recently, I think just a month or so ago. I don't remember exactly when. And the Biden administration obviously, wasn't that interested. The political preferences of its constituents are generally more pro-immigration. So there's been some pressure on the Biden administration to try to reverse some of the immigration policies that had been implemented by the Trump administration, including those implemented during 2020 when the pandemic started. So the Biden administration has actually kind of dragged its feet on a lot of that. A lot of people on the left are not really happy about it, but they finally made at least a token effort anyway to remove some of the rules. And just recently, they got rid of the COVID-19 rule. Again, I don't remember the technical name for the rule, but basically that's what it was. And in retaliation for that, the governor of Texas implemented a new, what would you call it? I guess a rule of his own, if you like, in which trucks coming in from Mexico would be subject to more stringent checks along the border. And these checks were not done by, obviously the Border Patrol, which is a federal institution. Rather, they were being conducted by state entities. And they said that they would do that until the rule was re-implemented. And, it got some headlines, and it, like you point out, it created a lot of, it created some bottlenecks for Mexican trucks that were trying to come in and bring, this, that, or the other good into the United States. I think fruit in particular was disproportionately impacted since that's more time sensitive as a perishable item. But I think it was also impacting the supply chains of automotive manufacturers since they source a lot of their intermediate parts from maquiladoras right
Mm.
across the border. So that created a problem for a couple weeks. The governor kind of implied that it would be a long-term thing, but eventually he backed down because the private sector was pretty much screaming at him, telling him that it was stupid. So he got his headlines, and it seems that was enough. So since then, he's what would you call it? Well, he's removed the rule, rescinded. There we go. He rescinded the rule, and now things are more or less back to normal, as I understand it.
It seems a little bit confusing to me because wasn't I think for a lot of people who are more right leaning, they're maybe less wary of COVID or concerned about it and that kind of a thing.
Mhm.
So for him to make a rule that's like more COVID conscious, it seems a little bit contradictory. But I
Well,
haven't tracked all of his COVID policies.
Well, it really wasn't about COVID. It was really about stemming immigration,
Mm.
specifically immigration by undocumented migrants trying to cross the border
But these are like business
illegally.
trucks.
Yeah, these are business trucks, but again, it was meant to be like a kind of punishment, right? He was trying to, well, I mean, not even really a punishment. It was really more just an attempt to pander to his constituents to show them that he was taking the issue of the border safety seriously.
Mm.
Immigration and border security are major issues amongst conservative constituents in the United States. And a lot of Republican politicians, especially those that have bigger ambitions in national politics, like the governor of Texas does, they tend to tap that well pretty frequently in order to try to build support amongst those constituents.
Mm.
So I don't think he had any kind of grand plan in mind. I think he was just doing it to kind of show that he was doing something, but I don't think it was a particularly well thought out policy. Again, it mostly served to inhibit economic activity that damaged American producers as much as Mexican producers. I think he did technically get the Mexican state of, what was it, Chihuahua, maybe? I don't recall exactly, but one of the states in Mexico that is along the Texas border The governor of Texas basically talked to the governor of that state, and they apparently reached some kind of agreement in which the checks would continue only on the Mexican side of the border. I don't know how substantive that agreement has been and whether or not it's actually being enforced, but the governor kind of made that out to be a kind of conciliation prize on his part. He was not able to get the COVID policy at the federal level re-implemented, but he says he was at least able to get these checks to continue to be carried out on the Mexican side of the border, which technically is about COVID, but also, again, is more about trying to stem illegal immigration into the United States.
Consolation prize.
Oh, thank you. What did I say? Conciliation?
Yes.
My apologies.
It's okay. Makes me feel
brain.
marginally useful during Agent Smith time.
You're very useful. You do a lot of clarifying here. Sometimes I don't always get the ideas out right. But yeah, that's the gist of the issue. It was basically just a kind of political stunt. I never got the impression there was any real chance that he would achieve the nominal objective of getting the Biden administration to reverse course on that. It's pretty common. I live in Texas, so I hear a lot about this. The Texas government, specifically conservatives in the Texas government, kind of go out of their way to hit on border security very frequently. There's been a lot of election ads that have been coming out, the past month or so, if not earlier, and they pretty frequently hit on border security as being a major issue. So I'm used to it. It didn't surprise me. I guess it was of interest to people outside the United States because I kept reading about it on the BBC World News. Apparently, they thought it was some kind of big deal.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, some of it I think is just the check and balance of states' rights as well. Because for any state, they do have certain powers and decisions and things they can do that are different from the federal government. And ever since the U.S. was initially formed, there have been people who have been more federalist or less federalist for who should have the most power. And Texas, of all states, is definitely one that is like, fuck you, we should have more power, and the main government of the U.S. should have a lot less than it currently does.
Mm-hmm.
So this whole ordeal is very unsurprising to that end.
Yeah.
Does he want to run for president, Mr. Abbott?
The governor of Texas, Greg Abbott. No, I don't think so. But he could be sort of laying the groundwork to do it in the future if he likes.
Mm-hmm.
Of course, George W. Bush, who went on to become president, used to be governor of Texas. So it's not unprecedented for a Texan governor to use the high-profile position of governor as a kind of launching pad into national office. So he could be trying to set up something for later, but I think for now he's just kind of trying to build a name for himself nationally, and also at the same time he's also trying to fend off criticism from the right. Because of course there's, within the political parties of the United States, a lot of political infighting between the left and right wings of each given party. And Greg Abbott, of course, like any politician, wants to fend off what we call a primary challenge here. Somebody could challenge him and run on a platform that is further right than the one that Abbott has right now, saying that they're a real conservative and that Abbott is a rhino, a Republican in name only. So that is an ever-present threat in American politics, not only for the Republican Party, but for the Democratic Party. And so politicians often kind of do a little pandering now and again in order to just try to stay in the good graces of the fringe element within their party. Well, maybe not the fringe element, but in the Republican case, the right wing of the party, and in the Democrats' case, the left wing of the party. So that was sort of my impression of what was happening with the border. That was sort of Abbott's way, not only of laying the foundation for a potential later run at a higher national office, but also trying to mollify some of the more hard right immigration conservatives.
Well, that makes sense. Speaking of governors doing stuff to flex their abilities, Florida. Florida, Disney, DeSantis, that was also a thing. I didn't quite understand what it is, but the gist of it is there's like special districts in Florida, Disney being one of them, where they get certain privileges by virtue of doing a lot of business in a certain area. What's the deal with that one?
Well, saying they have certain privileges is an understatement. I mean, they literally pretty well run that area. You know, the city services in that region, I think they're county level, even not even city level. Those are all basically owned by Disney. And so they manage pretty much all, if not, or most, if not all, of the public services in and around Disney World
Mm-hmm.
over there. And that was a special provision that was written into a law that was passed back in the, I want to say the 1950s. I'm sure there's somebody who's read more about it than I have, that, you know, it wasn't like a big priority for me to follow it. But from what I read, anyway, there was a law passed giving Disney these special powers of governance in and around the land they bought around Disney World. And that was a kind of quid pro quo, basically, to attract, you know, Disney, to get them to come there and set up, because obviously the state of Florida wanted that. The state of Florida was a very different state back in the 1950s. It was still kind of a swampland, basically, back then. It had long been a very marginal state up until that point. So, in addition, you know, besides all of the tourists that started coming, starting in the 1950s, Disney World was also another major feather in their sort of economic cap. So it was a big deal for the government of the state to try to attract that, and so they were quite happy to give Disney everything they wanted, and to try to get them to set up there. There had been tourists before then. There had been, I think, like really wealthy tourists in the early 20th century, but I don't think there was really any mass tourism like we think of it now until the 50s, 1960s. And then, of course, all the retirees started moving down roughly in that same time period. So Florida, very different at that time. Since then, its economy has grown a lot. And at this point, it's a fairly developed state, or at least most of it. It kind of differs regionally. It's a very strange state, to put it mildly, in a
Mm-hmm.
lot of ways. But anyway, yeah, Disney has all these special powers as a result of the law. And there was this big issue over basically Disney being a quote unquote woke corporation, as some of the company's conservative critics have alleged. And that stems from Disney kind of implementing various policies that are considered LGBT friendly, and also, uh, according to some of their conservative employees anyway, the company has been pressuring them not to, what's the word I want, not to violate, you know, the company's norms,
Mm-hmm.
which involve not criticizing or using otherwise hostile language towards certain groups, among them LGBT people in the LGBT community.
Mm-hmm.
But also, of course, that extends to, you know, other marginalized groups in the United States. But anyway, conservative employees complained about it, and the governor stepped in and started pressuring Disney to try to do something about this, you know, to try to reverse some of the new policies that they'd implemented in that vein. And the result is, as we've seen, the governor of Florida putting pressure on the company by threatening to revoke its special privileges as accorded under that law that was passed in the 1950s.
So he's just threatened it. He hasn't actually made a change yet.
I think they did do it. I think he kind of led the effort, and Florida's Congress technically took action. But I was reading a couple hours ago that apparently the law involved the government paying off the debt of Disney, or at least Disney World, if the special powers accorded to them under the law were ever revoked. And since that hasn't happened yet, apparently Disney is taking the position that the law is basically void until those debts have been paid. And apparently it's something like $1 billion, you know, so it's not a small amount of money.
Mm.
And I don't know if the Florida state government is really going to consider $1 billion worth the cost of this kind of pandering. It would be very expensive pandering if it were. So I suspect that they'll technically legally recognize the law as revoked, but since they won't actually pay off the debt, I suspect anyway, then technically nothing will actually change.
Hmm.
People love to grandstand. It's a grand American political tradition, Neuro.
Yeah, there's a lot of just general effect that you can have on the public overall by making moves like this, and you're kind of weighing the short-term cost and or loss versus the long-term shift in the perception of yourself, your party, your region, all this kind of stuff. The stream seems to have disconnected for just a moment, but it's attempting to reconnect.
Whoops.
Discord sounds fine.
Oh, yep. Internet troubles.
I think it's on Twitch's end.
How's Twitch doing?
The latest thing that was a noteworthy thing was a Bloomberg article talking about potentially changing the revenue split. Yeah, and then also allowing people to stream to other platforms. So changing the exclusivity agreement for myself, who's a Twitch partner, and anyone else who is, if they stream to another platform, I think that violates their contract, so they can get in trouble and lose their potential partnership that they have set up with Twitch. My OBS and everything is fine, so it's gonna continue to try to reconnect here.
Gotcha.
I think I can stop the stream and restart it, but the VOD is continuous. There's gonna be a secret mystery part of this video that no one saw live, so we can say some weird stuff right now that'll just show up on YouTube. Okay, we're trying again. Nope. Oh! It's back. Ladies and gentlemen, press 3 if you can hear me. My internet did a weird sort of thing. I disconnected from the StarCraft match and from Twitch, but not from Discord. No idea how this occurred. My opponent has been blessed with how many MMRs? I can't even tell because I have to restart my game. I saw my opponent in the Twitch chat say, Neuro, no, F. I want to play. I am sorry. This was out of my control. Yeah, the Discord connection was solid. Big ups to Discord. While the stream was down, but the recording continued, we just checked in about how Twitch is and what Twitch is doing. The latest noteworthy thing with Twitch was the Bloomberg article. There have been some people who were suspecting that maybe that was posted just as like a feeler for how Twitch would respond to it. Instead of Twitch saying, we're considering doing this, if they leak some information that's sort of more of a rumor, and then they get to see the response, then they can swoop in and be the righteous ones who, in the case that people rage about it and say, no, you can't change our splits, blah, blah, they'll be like, we're not going to change your splits. And then they appear to be the good guys. I have no confirmation of this. I don't actually know on the back end like what the actual Twitch thought process is here or what they're going to decide to do, but it's definitely something that people have been talking about. Personally, I'm happy here. I like streaming here and that kind of a thing. So if that change went through, that would be a pretty big minus to my overall earnings. And it would mean that I need to kind of diversify and be more active on YouTube. So it would incentivize streamers to be less loyal to the platform and to experiment and explore with other platforms. I don't know how profitable that would be for Twitch. That's like a money question that I don't really know the answer to. Like, what are people's sub splits? How much more money would they get if they made our sub splits worse and had people streaming less on the platform? Big question mark there. But the thing with live streaming is there isn't really another major competitor. Mixer rose up to try to challenge Twitch. Mixer lost and folded. YouTube has been kind of flopping about and doing some live stream stuff, but from what I've heard from people, the chat experience is really bad. And then what else is there? Facebook gaming. There have been a few streamers who were given some ridiculous deal of millions of dollars. These are like the top streamers to be exclusive with Facebook for a period of time. They do this, they earn the huge sum of money, and then they come back because it's not as good of a platform. There just aren't as many regular viewers and stuff, that kind of a thing. Facebook doesn't really have the best name right now, which is kind of why they have this whole metaverse thing. They're trying to change their name. Yeah. Reminds me of Time Warner Cable.
So Twitch is still the market leader then.
For sure. Yeah, for this kind of interactive live streaming content that is more family friendly.
Gotcha.
I do YouTube videos, but the lion's share of my earnings come from the subscribers and supporters here. It's a pretty different kind of content. I think I do better with the live improv of Twitch more than like plan stuff. I'm not really much of a planner. My edge has always been endurance and improv, where I can stream really consistently with mental stability and just give regular content that's what people expect, and I don't really rage too much. Some people are really clever and they think of awesome ideas for videos and stuff like that. That takes a lot of work. I'm not quite as good at that. Excuse me.
So you're not worried about it?
I'm not super worried. I think if the change was actually going through, that would be a thing. I'm prepared to adapt if I have to. So I don't really have like a sky is falling mindset with it. It would be a short-term minus for me. My viewers, I think, are relatively loyal. So if I moved, I would probably have a decent bit of people who would follow me. Or if I streamed in another place, that would also mean that I discover new people, which could be cool and fruitful in its own way. One of the skill sets that I've developed with this that can't be really taken away by any one platform is just interaction and entertainment in real time. And that's a skill set that I think is basically here to stay. It should be one of the last jobs that gets replaced by robots. It seems like it'd be fairly hard to do, of like being able to read chat, be empathetic, be interactive, be personal, and that sort of a deal. And I'm happy doing what I'm doing. I do have the occasional question of, when are you going to go get your PhD and your degree? Not now. I'm having too much fun playing video games. Chat, has the stream been stable since it went down? Does it look fine and everything? I don't see any dropped frames.
Everything good?
I think it's good. Bitrate looks good, they say. Excellent.
Well, I hope I was able to satisfactorily answer your question about Disney.
Yeah, I've heard that DeSantis is one of the people who's more obviously gonna think about running for president.
Yeah.
So this kind of a move would score a lot of points with a lot of voters. Obviously not everybody. Some people might think that it's a silly move, but there will be some people who think, wow, like look at this guy standing up against this big company, and maybe they agree with him and stuff like that. So yeah, definitely a big point scoring move. And if you just want to be governor, it might be a silly play, but if you want to be president, I could see it as a, like up in the ante kind of a deal.
It seems to be the case here.
Yeah. I've talked with some conservatives who like him and they like what he's doing. So
yeah, I think his biggest problem is Donald Trump, because it's still not entirely clear whether or not he's going to run again in 2024.
Oh, he hasn't officially declared that he will?
No. And so that kind of creates some ambiguity, which is going to be a problem before too long, because they're going to start campaigning probably in 2023. And there's not too much longer before then. As shocking as that may sound, we've only got maybe, 6-7 months or so before the next presidential campaign starts again. So if Trump hasn't made it clear by then, there's going to be some pretty big confusion amongst some of the other candidates that might want to run. Because I don't think if he does run, then anybody's going to want to run against him. Unless there's some kind of, what did they call them? Lincoln Republicans or whatever that group was. But I don't think they have much chance of actually beating him. So
what are the Lincoln Republicans?
they're not... I can't remember exactly what the name of the group was. I want to say it was like Lincoln something. Maybe somebody in chat could answer that for me. I guess this would be a good time for the usual disclaimer. I'm not an expert in everything I talk about on here. So if I ever say anything that's wrong, stupid, or biased, please do tell me if I'm wrong. I want to know more than anybody. I don't read chat while we do this, but I do read it later, so I will see it eventually. But yeah, participation is encouraged in that regard. So that said, yeah, there is a group of Republicans that just really hated Trump, basically. And they kind of fancied themselves more like center-right moderate Republicans. And they formed their own little group to try to undermine Trump and some of the Trump-aligned politicians by kind of going after them in primaries and campaigning against them in the 2020 presidential election. And I think the group is still kicking around. You know, I don't think they ever really like formally disbanded after Trump lost in 2020. But I'm not sure exactly what they're up to now. But anyway, yeah, that is a group, and I think they did try to field a candidate in the Republican primary in 20 whatever it was, 2020, I guess. But anyway, yeah, that's basically what they are.
Yeah, it makes sense. There's a pretty wide demographic of people who are conservative, but they don't like Trump's style of behavior or leadership or whatever. There's a difference in professionalism and tact and also diplomacy between some of the more establishment Republican candidates and Trump's style of shoot from the hip, say whatever the fuck you think about on Twitter at 3 a.m. Some people like that. They're like, oh, it's cool that he doesn't give a fuck. He's not like the other politicians, that kind of a thing. But it's also kind of gross. I think a lot of people from Europe are just completely aghast that we elected Trump as president, and a lot of Americans too. So the difference between having conservative values and having that style of politician is pretty wide. I'm really alarmed that he got such a large share of the Christian vote that he did. It just confuses the hell out of me. I think of Jesus Christ in my head, and then I see what he says and does, and it's just like the distance here.
Yeah.
It's a very wide chasm. But his style, and probably the reason why he crushed the Republican primary so hard when he's run, is he goes to his opponents and he just like makes them look really bad and basically creates a villain persona of each one. So that while, yeah, he may have his problems, look at his opponents. They're like way worse. They don't have their shit together at all. They're really weak. They're maybe really bad and corrupt and that kind of a thing. And it shifts the attention from the issues that he might have as a candidate to the issues that they have as candidates, rather than building up his own line of reasoning of why he's the best. It's why they're bad and not viable, which is it's a valid tactic. It's not against the rules. It's just different than a lot of our other elections had gone in the past.
Yeah. Yeah, he was definitely a outsider candidate.
Mm-hmm.
Probably the penultimate one.
Not completely outsider in the sense that he had rubbed shoulders with a lot of big names in politics for a long time. So he's not new to the game. He's just in a different position than he was before.
Yeah, there's a lot of truth to that. But even amongst guys that do that, Trump was a little unusual in that he had not really been involved in politics all that much over the course of his life. You know, if you look at something like the Koch brothers, they've been involved in politics for a long time, at least on the funding end. So they were, I think they actually died not too long ago, but they were anyway players in the system. But Trump really hadn't been, or at least that had not been my impression. Certainly not at a national level. Maybe he was more active in New York City politics. But he didn't really seem to really take it seriously until, 2015, 2016. So he kind of came out of nowhere in that sense. I know that he did kind of try to run for president before, but I didn't get the impression that that was like a really serious effort on his part.
Well, we'll see what happens. Do you know who is going to run on the Democratic ticket? He laughs.
No, no, I don't. I don't think anybody does. I think Joe Biden has kind of hinted now and again that he won't run again.
Mm-hmm.
Although he did say at one point that he would, but who knows if he actually follows through on that. So, maybe we end up with a rematch between Trump and Biden, or maybe we just end up with two totally new names,
Mm-hmm.
which wouldn't be a bad thing in my mind. I don't have anything against older politicians, but we've had some older ones a lot, over the past couple decades. I think we could do with some new blood at this point.
Yeah.
So having some younger folks jump in, I think, would be best for everybody, especially given the rapidity of technological and economic change in the country over the past couple decades. Some people who are kind of more familiar with those changes, I think, would be useful in government. But we'll see. It's anybody's guess. I don't think Kamala Harris is gonna get it.
Mm-hmm.
I think she's kind of been hammered by some of the immigration stuff that she got saddled with by the administration. So that's kind of put her in an awkward position.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not really sure who else, though. Buttigieg is in the administration. They gave him like some weird niche envoy type job. But I don't think he's like made a big name for himself while he's been there. There's always Elizabeth Warren. I guess she could make the effort again. I don't think Bernie Sanders will run again. I think he's just kind of too old at this point. It would be really hard on him.
Mm-hmm.
It's not impossible, but I'm pretty skeptical. I think it's more likely that he would try to back Warren or somebody like her.
The American people need a politician who isn't old as shit. Thank you, Bernie.
Yeah, it's a pretty wide open field, relatively speaking, if Biden doesn't run. If Biden does run, then that pretty much locks out all the contenders. And so then he'll probably just have a uncontested field, unless one of the squad, or one of their affiliated type politicians tries to challenge him from the left, kind of like Bernie Sanders did. Then there could be a challenge, but who knows? But given how volatile American politics has been recently, it's not entirely impossible that a challenger candidate could actually beat him in the primary. So can't rule it out. Yeah, American politics is unusually unstable at this point. When I was growing up, back in the day, a million years ago, you pretty much knew who was going to be running and who was going to get the nomination. Like, generally, the vice president of the incumbent, if the incumbent had already won re-election, generally the vice president in that case would almost invariably get the nod. So there was very little ambiguity in that sense. And generally, the opposition would not elect, but nominate a pretty high-profile politician, somebody like who was a governor or whatever. So you had a pretty good idea of who had like the best odds. And maybe occasionally you would get like some weird disruptor, like a Jimmy Carter or something, like what was his name? Ross Perot, somebody like that. But for the most part, it was a pretty predictable process.
Mm-hmm.
And then over the past 10 years or so, it's just been, the Wild West, pretty much. It's just been wide open time and again. You just never know what you're going to get.
Whoever can talk the most shit will win.
Well, sometimes it feels like that. But yeah, I wouldn't pay too much attention to it until probably early 2023. That's when it's really going to start up again.
Mm-hmm.
I wish it wouldn't. I wish it would. I wish that the parties would kind of pressure states to kind of move the primaries back closer to the election like it used to be. They kind of were creeping further and further out over time, and now it's like, almost 2 years out. Just crazy shit. And it just extends the whole campaigning season to a ridiculous degree. I think there was an effort at one point to try to do that, but I don't think anything came of it, unfortunately. Most countries have campaigns before an election that last like a month, which is much more reasonable in my opinion. It's also much cheaper because they do that. If you're going to do like a 2-year presidential campaign, then that racks up costs pretty thoroughly.
It does come across a little bit like an entertainment spectacle in the US,
Yeah.
where people talk about it a bunch. It gets a ton of media coverage. So yeah, I can kind of see the attention upside of having a long election cycle. Whoever's involved in that process certainly gets a lot of airtime.
Yeah, it does have its advantages, which is why they do it. It also creates a lot of opportunities for upsets.
Yeah.
If there's only 1 month of campaigning,
Whoever had the
then
most momentum leading into it is going to have a much larger advantage.
yeah, exactly. But you have to maintain momentum over a longer period of time when you do it the way we do it, and so that creates opportunities for people to kind of flail.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, Biden almost flailed. He almost flamed out, but then he came back in the South Carolina primary in the lead up to 2020 election. Yeah, before that he was struggling a bit. I think it was who was I think it was Buttigieg for a while that kind of had the inside track on him in the first couple primaries, and then Warren was up there as well. And then Biden came back in South Carolina, and he kind of carried that momentum forward, and was eventually able to win the nomination later on. Although Sanders definitely challenged them the whole way, they took that all the way to the convention. It just didn't work out in the end, though. They didn't have the votes. Well, has there been anything else that's kind of caught your eye?
We didn't really cover Ukraine too much, but I have seen some updates with that, some counterplays by Ukraine, and then the stuff about the ghost of Kiev being killed in combat and potentially being a real dude. Maybe the kill counts and stuff for how many planes he shot down were exaggerated somewhat, but maybe
Well, the
it was
whole
a real
thing was,
person.
yeah, there was a real person, but it was just, the actual Ghost of Kiev story was just a sort of Reddit meme, basically, that kind of spread around.
Mm-hmm.
The actual man himself was just like a dude. He was just a pilot,
Mm-hmm.
and I think there was a video of his aircraft that kind of made the rounds on social media, and it was allegedly the Ghost of Kiev, so he kind of got the moniker as a result.
Mm-hmm.
But I don't think he was like some kind of Ubermensch, going out and shooting down the Russian Air Force or anything dramatic like that. But yeah, he was killed, basically. He was killed in the fighting. Well, let's see. I mean, we haven't done Ukraine in a while, and I do have something of backlog from the past couple weeks.
Sure.
So
Oh,
we might.
the only other thing before we dive into that was the Macron wins the French election. I think the last time
Mhm.
we talked, it was him
Yeah.
versus Le Pen. So he wins. Not really the surprise candidate to win, but just I guess more another point for the establishment to carry its weight forward. Most of the people in my chat were more hoping Macron would win, but he's kind of like Biden in the sense that he's sort of close to the center, and there aren't really that many people who are huge fans of him. It's
Yeah.
like the compromise candidate.
Yeah, he's a representative of the center of French politics, which, unfortunately has been shrinking. It's been noted repeatedly in international media that the size of the far left and the far right in France are combined much larger than either the center right or the center left, or both combined, for that matter. Which is the first time in a long time that's been true, maybe the first time ever, certainly in the modern history of France. And so Macron did not really win because he had a mandate, from a huge, larger part of the population that wanted him in power. He won because the far left hated the far right and voted for him
Mm-hmm.
to make sure that Le Pen didn't win. So that's not exactly a ringing endorsement from the population, and he recognized as much in his victory speech after the election. So that's going to kind of tie his hands a little bit. Also, there's going to be a legislative election in France. A couple months from now? I think it's already May. I can't believe it's already May. But there's going to be an election, and most likely on March, which is Macron's party, is probably going to lose seats. And it's not really entirely clear to me who's going to get a majority in the legislature, but it's not going to be Macron. So what's going to happen is they're going to have what the French call a cohabitation government. So Macron will be president, but the prime minister is going to be from some other party, some other group, either one of Le Pen's people or probably one of Mélenchon. Actually, I'm not sure how to pronounce his name. One of Mélenchon's people, possibly. He's like the preeminent far left candidate in France at this point. And that's probably going to hobble him in his attempt to reform the economy and do other sort of liberalizing, modernizing type things. Well, maybe not modernizing, but let's say liberalizing. I was talking with one of our French listeners on, well, maybe not talking, but corresponding in some YouTube comments about some of the liberal economic reforms that various French governments have been trying to pass. It's a very interesting conversation. For people interested in the subject, you can see that in the YouTube comments of our last video.
What are they trying to pass?
Like different things like pension reform and relaxing some of the restrictions on hiring and firing practices, tax reform, basically liberalization type stuff, things that are meant to kind of loosen up economic regulations and generate economic growth by boosting the private sector. And stuff like that can have an impact, but it's also extremely controversial, and sometimes it's a little hit or miss, depending on how it's implemented. Our French listener made the point that Francois Hollande, who was a president of France back during the aughts for a while, despite being a socialist, actually tried to implement, some economic reforms, and they didn't really have an impact. So it's not as though they're a panacea, for sure. But yeah, Macron has tried to do economic reforms intermittently, but he's met with a lot of resistance. In particular, well, I guess the environmental reforms were a little different. That's partly what set off the Gilets Jaunes protests. That was kind of a different phenomenon. But certainly the liberalizing reforms always set off the left wing of French politics and create lots of consternation and protests and whatnot. I think there were actually protests after the election that Macron just won by people upset that he'd won re-election.
And but anyway, were not Le Pen's people. They were environmentalists or something, or people further left?
Left wing in general. As there was lots of people that people on the far right see Macron as being too lefty, maybe a little too woke, not cracking down enough on terrorism and immigration, which are sort of the big issues for them. But then people on the left think that Macron is sort of an elitist, pro-capitalist liberalizer, which they hate. They don't appreciate that. And so when he won, there was a kind of an outcry there. I mean, the protests that I read about were in Paris, and I don't really think of that as being a stronghold for Le Pen voters, So I'm pretty sure they were disproportionately left-wing voters, most likely.
Yeah, that's probably similar in many places around the world where cities tend to be more progressive and rural areas tend to be more conservative.
Yeah, in general, that's kind of a general guideline. I'm sure there's some exceptions, but I feel like even in those cases, you would still see city politics that were at least relatively more progressive than the surrounding rural territory. I did have some interesting statistics that I picked up from a newsletter. Apparently, Le Pen won the majority of votes among voters aged 25 to 34, around 60%, which I found quite shocking, actually. I'd always associated younger voters more with left-wing politics. Generally it's older voters who tend to skew more conservative, so it was pretty weird to see that. One article I read noted that kind of boded ill well for the future because it suggested that the far right kind of might be able to pick up more votes over time as those people got older and started voting for them more, and as younger people continued to vote for them. But it could also be just that this is kind of representative of protest votes, people just voting against Macron. So I don't know that there's necessarily a far-right cohort of youth voters coming up into the French demographic tree.
Mm-hmm.
Or not tree, what's the... Oh, I'm blanking out. I forgot what that's called. Demographic something. It's slipping my mind. But anyway, he also won 2/3 of voters without college education. So, no, Le Pen, sorry, she won 2/3 of voters without college education, which is no surprise. That's kind of what everybody expected. And then Macron won 2/3 of professional workers. So again, that kind of illustrates the class divide here between Macron and Le Pen, and between this sort of new schism that's emerging in French politics that's disrupting sort of the established political divisions that we think of between left and right, and at least in a developed country. So let's see, that said, so did you hear about the sinking of the Russian flagship?
Yes, I did. And I heard that there was a piece from the Holy Cross of Christ that was on it.
I had not heard that.
Perhaps that was propaganda.
It may well have been. Well, I don't know. What do you know about the ship in question?
It was very large. I think it was the Fuck You Russian warship boat.
It was, actually, yeah.
Yeah.
Same one. Yeah, the thing that really surprised me about it, besides the fact that it was technically the flagship of the Black Sea Fleet, was also how big it was. Like I'd always known that the Russians had missile cruisers like that, but I hadn't realized just how large they were. It's a pretty substantive ship. So that's a pretty bad loss for them. It's certainly a bit embarrassing, considering. The Russians were pretty cagey about what exactly happened, but eventually they did kind of come clean that the ship sank. So whether or not it sank when it was attacked or whether it sank later when they were trying to tow it to port is not entirely clear, but regardless, something happened to the ship to cause some kind of fire, which apparently spread to the ship's munitions and caused an explosion, which allegedly is what sank the ship. Whether that fire was caused by an accident or by a Neptune anti-ship missile is open to debate. I haven't really seen proof one way or the other. The Ukrainians are claiming that they hit it with the Neptunes. And I guess there could have been a fire that was destructive enough to sink the ship, but I'm a little skeptical.
The ship has a lot of metal on it.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. Well, certainly exploding munitions can do a lot of damage. I don't doubt that.
Mm-hmm.
But I don't know if it would be enough to necessarily outright sink it, even in a storm. So that's why I'm more inclined to suspect that it really was the anti-ship missiles.
Well, it's kind of embarrassing in either case. Like, either you have a massive flagship that is supposed to be the pride of your navy that messed up, or someone else messed it up and defeated it.
Yeah.
Both cases are not the best outcomes for your boat.
Yeah, it doesn't really change the overall strategic situation. It did lead to the Russian Navy sort of withdrawing further away from the Ukrainian coast, but it's not going to do anything to inhibit the Russian blockade of said coast. Mm-hmm. So that's going to continue unabated. That's creating some waves in global grain markets. Ukraine is having trouble getting the grain, of which it produces quite a bit, out of the country to its consumers abroad. But I did read the other day that the state of Bulgaria has said that it would basically give free and open access to Ukrainian grain so that it could come into the country and be exported through Bulgarian ports, which are not being blockaded by the Russians and hence have unabated access to the world grain market. That could work, but I'm not sure if Bulgarian port facilities are going to have the capacity to export all of that grain. It's going to be a lot more grain than is usually exported from Bulgaria, I suspect. So that may be a bottleneck there, but it's also better than nothing. So it's a bit of progress there, a bit of good news for the Ukrainian government if they can make that work. Let's see, there was some new information about the air battle in the first days of the war. One of the open questions was why the Russian Air Force was not able to suppress either Ukrainian air defenses or the Ukrainian Air Force in the first couple days of the war. So that was not entirely clear, but since the past couple weeks, basically, some new information has come out. There was an interview with a Ukrainian air defense personnel, some Ukrainian air defense personnel, and they revealed that Ukrainian air defenses had actually taken heavy losses in the opening days of the war. So it's not as though they were able to completely avoid destruction. There was a major attempt by the Russians to do that. But apparently the CIA went out of their way to share intelligence about what targets the Russians were going to attack, and that was able to, they were able thus to save a considerable number of both air defense assets as well as Ukrainian Air Force assets, as a result of which the Ukrainians have been able to continue to significantly inhibit Russian air operations, which had been expected to be one of their major advantages in the war. So it was a pretty big win there for the Ukrainians. To be able to protect those assets and to continue to defend their airspace. They can't completely defend it. Again, they took pretty considerable losses, so there's definitely holes, but they have enough air defenses at this point to prevent the Russians from operating freely. So as a result, the Russian army has not had nearly as much air support as they would like, with corresponding impacts on battlefield outcomes. So a nice little contribution there from the CIA.
Intelligence is key. Speaking of which, I should scout in this game.
Have you been following the siege of Mariupol at all?
I've heard that there are still Ukrainian battalions in there, and they have not fully surrendered yet, but the city is very messed up.
Yeah, pretty thoroughly so. Well, the Russians have pretty much taken the city. They've gotten the center of the city. They've gotten all of the institutions of government. Most of the city at this point is under their control. But there's one steel plant, basically, that they have not taken yet, where the Ukrainians are holed up. And from what I've been reading, it's a natural fortress, because it's not just like a single factory. It's like a whole complex. And from what I've read, it's almost the size of a small city in and of itself. And it's also got a number of tunnels that run underneath it that the Ukrainians have been using. So it's going to be exceedingly difficult, I suspect, for the Russians to take that, and they've been taking their time, basically, picking away at it. They had actually said at one point that they would, Vladimir Putin himself actually said that the Russian army would not assault the plant, which I believe is called the Azov steel plant. He said instead that they would surround the plant and then cut it off completely from any outside resupply and basically starve them out over time.
Mm-hmm.
But apparently they decided to scrap that because I was reading the other day that they'd started attacking the plant. So much for Plan A. I suspect it's going to be a long, drawn-out battle because the Ukrainians have a considerable influence with this. There was a lot of similar fighting at the Donetsk airport. Donetsk is the capital of Donetsk Oblast, the far eastern province in Ukraine. And the city there had an airport that the Ukrainian army was able to hold on to for a very long period of time against an onslaught of both Russian army and Russian separatist forces way back in 2014. And they eventually were pushed out, but it took a lot of heavy fighting, and the airport itself was utterly devastated. I believe they called the defenders cyborgs at the time for their ability to live under such extreme conditions as there were at the airport at the time. So the steel plant could be basically just a larger version of that. We'll see how long they hold out. They've certainly held out far longer than anybody gave them credit for. I can't even count how many times now over the past month or so that I've read that the Ukrainian defenders in Mariupol are, quote-unquote, a couple of days away from surrender, end quote. That's been a pretty common theme, but they're still hanging in there, so more power to them. At this point, the bigger issue is the civilians. The Russians have kind of shown how they deal with civilians in areas under their control, and it's not particularly nice. So there's some concern for the civilian population of the city. Most people there, I think, have left, but there are still some there. And there's apparently a decent number that are actually holed up with Ukrainian forces in the steel plant. They're apparently hiding underground in those tunnels I mentioned. So there's been attempts to try to open a humanitarian corridor to evacuate them. And the Russians had not honored one they'd negotiated earlier, but apparently they did honor one in the past couple days. So there was maybe 100 or maybe a couple hundred of people that were able to get out that way. I'm not sure how many more people are there, or maybe how many more people there might be in the broader city at this point. That's still unclear. But at least they were able to get some people out. So that's pretty much where the siege is right now. I also read over the past couple of weeks that uh, the Ukrainian army was able to get some supplies to the units that were under siege in Mariupol, which was a little surprising. You'd think they would be completely cut off, but apparently they were able to get some in there. Apparently, there was also an attempt to extract some of the troops that were in Mariupol, but the helicopters involved were shot down by the Russians. So that apparently didn't work out. Let's see. I also read a little bit about artillery. Amongst the analytical community, there's been a lot of talk about, air forces, intelligence, Ukrainian infantry versus Russian infantry, but artillery hasn't been talked about as much until the past couple weeks. And, the reason they've been talking about it more is that there's kind of been a shift, which we've talked about, in past weeks, in the attitude of Western governments towards assisting Ukraine. When the war first started, it was expected that the Ukrainian army would eventually be overwhelmed and that the country would be fighting as an insurgency against Russian occupiers. And so some of the assistance that it was expected would be given was more the assistance that you would expect insurgents to get, maybe communications equipment, light weapons, stuff like that. But the Ukrainian army surprised everybody, and now it's conceivable that they could at least fight the Russian army to a stalemate, if not maybe push them out of their territory. So that's raised new questions about just what kinds of support they should be given, specifically heavy weapons. And there was a lot of reluctance at the beginning of the conflict to give those heavy weapons, but since then it seems that reluctance has dissolved, or at least is in the process of dissolving. So one of the heavy weapons that the Ukrainian government has requested is heavy artillery, and apparently Western governments are now sending that. So apparently, from what I was reading, mobile artillery is preferred, because as is modern warfare being what it is, mobile artillery is much less vulnerable to what's called counter battery fire. I imagine most of you know what that is, but for those of you who don't, counter battery fire is the act of firing back at artillery that is firing at you with your own artillery. And there's modern radar systems that are designed to detect incoming artillery shells and triangulate where exactly they're being fired from, so your own artillery will know where the enemy artillery are, thus allowing them to shell them in return and ideally destroy them. So Ukraine has had artillery since the beginning of the conflict and has been using them, but they're outnumbered. And they've wanted more so that they can sort of meet the Russians on a more even keel. And now that there's more weapons coming in, they're going to be able to do that. And again, I guess to kind of finish my thought there, mobile artillery is less vulnerable to counter battery fire because they can shoot and then relocate. So, by the time the Russian artillery will, triangulate where they were being fired at from, mobile artillery will already have moved and will be firing from a different location. So pretty useful there. I think the French have been the ones who have been sending most of the mobile artillery that they've been getting since there's been this shift in, Western aid practices. The United States has not, to my knowledge, been giving them mobile artillery. They've been sending them some of the old M777 fixed artillery pieces. So that's better than nothing, certainly, but those are also going to be a little more vulnerable. And I'm sure I'm sure the Ukrainians will continue to lobby to get some of the more modern stuff. I also read that with more artillery coming in to the Ukrainians, there could be some much bigger artillery battles going forward. And that kind of feeds into the whole Donbass offensive that's happening right now, which has officially started at this point. I think it started a week or so ago. So, that battle is going to be markedly different from the fighting up till now. And it could be that large-scale artillery battles are going to be part of the defining feature there. Although it's still going to take some time for the Western artillery that's been donated to actually, be used in conflict, be used in combat rather, because it still has to be shipped there, unloaded. Crews have to receive them, they have to be deployed, etc. So it could take some time. But hopefully it'll help them a little bit there. Also, I read a critique from a Russian soldier, apparently, who said that Ukrainian artillery is actually better than Russian artillery. From what he was saying, the Ukrainian artillery is just better quality and more precise. And also their personnel are better trained. Basically, they just have better trained artillerymen, which makes the artillery much more impactful and effective.
You don't really deal damage if you miss. At least not the
Yeah,
damage that you wanted.
yeah, it's better to be more precise if you can be, but that's kind of hard if you don't have the technology. The Russians, of course, are somewhat lacking in modern weapons, and so that's kind of forced them to be much less resilient, flexible, and much more inexact in which targets they're hitting. I think everybody's familiar at this point with how they use the artillery against cities. But there's also a bigger problem, which is that there's not very much coordination between infantry and artillery. Combined arms warfare, as has been shown repeatedly since the war started, doesn't really seem to be in their wheelhouse. And as a result, infantry that want artillery support, when they get into a fight, have been having trouble actually getting it in a timely manner and getting it on target. That could change a little bit in the Donbass because they seem to be a little more prepared for that. The conditions there are a little more favorable, and the Russian army is taking the war more seriously than it was at the start of the conflict. But that also doesn't necessarily matter much given all the other disadvantages that they experience. So maybe it won't matter that much, but certainly the Russians try to make up for their lack of precision weaponry with mass barrages of one sort or another, if not just outright indiscriminate barrages.
It's pray and spray. Or no. Spray and pray?
There
Reverse
you
order.
go. Yeah.
But with artillery instead of a rifle.
Well, historically, that's kind of been the gist of it. You fire in a big barrage and you hope you blow up something in the enemy camp. But it helps to know where the enemy is. There have been several Ukrainians that have kind of insulted and made fun of the Russian military for trying to shell them and just missing categorically and repeatedly. So that does seem to be a problem for them. It doesn't help that a lot of their better troops were lost in the first couple weeks of the war, so now they're having to bring in older equipment and with more poorly trained troops. There's a YouTube channel that actually has that's been publishing recorded conversations, between and among Russian servicemen, and they're not particularly happy with conditions in Ukraine right now. The morale, as has been reported, seems to be pretty low. And they also complain a lot about the newer troops that are being brought in as replacements, and they say that they're basically cowards, incompetent, don't know what they're doing, etc. So if that's an accurate portrayal of some of the reinforcements that are being sent in, it doesn't really say much for the prospects of the most recent Russian offensive in the Donbass, or for that matter, for long-term prospects for the war in general. Let's see. Oh, there's been all the Moldova drama for the past couple days. Have you heard any of that?
Yeah, there was firing or something in the Transnistria region.
Yeah. Yeah, there was 3 explosions in Transnistria, or in the Transnistria Republic, rather. And I actually have it in my notes. One of them was targeting the state security headquarters in Tiraspol, which is the capital of the Transnistria Republic. They also targeted an old Soviet-era radio mast, which had been broadcasting Russian news. And apparently a military unit in a village just outside the capital called Perkarny was also targeted. So who is responsible for all of that is unclear. The Russians are saying that it was Ukrainians. The Ukrainians say that it was a Russian false flag, and that the Russians are trying to use that as an excuse to mobilize Russian peacekeepers, quote unquote, that are deployed in the Transnistria Republic. It's hard to tell. I mean, the Ukrainians certainly have reason to try to target Russian forces in Transnistria, but at the same time, it would also make sense for them not to do that, since it would just give the Russians an excuse that they want to try to mobilize those forces. But I don't think anything will come of it one way or the other, regardless of what the Russians may or may not be trying to do as far as a false flag operation. I don't think it's feasible at all for them to try to use the forces they have in the Transnistria Republic, principally just for the reason that they don't have very many. I think I was reading that they don't have more than like 1,500 or so troops there, something like that. It's not much. Like one battalion tactical group, as they're called, is something like around 1,000 plus people. So, the Ukrainians have sliced through a couple dozen now battalion tactical groups at this juncture. So deploying what amounts to a single battalion tactical group in the west of the country is probably going to end badly for the Russians. I guess they could mobilize some of the Transnistria Republic's military, but I don't think they have much to offer in that regard. It's exceedingly poor territory, and they really don't have much money for maintaining a standing army of any size or quality.
Poor territory in what way?
Sorry, what?
Poor territory in what way?
Economically, it's just very low GDP, very low development index, like very low quality of life. It's not a territory that has done well for itself since the collapse of the Soviet Union. Probably the biggest industry is crime at this point, if not government corruption. Moldova isn't in a much better state in that regard, but I think it's much more stable at least than Transnistria. Yeah, Moldova is another wild card here, because if the Transnistria Republic and the Russian forces there did try to, say, invade Ukraine, there's some question of what the Moldovan government would do, because of course they claim that territory. So if they, if the Russian forces there are distracted with fighting in Ukraine, that may be an excuse for the Moldovan army to be deployed and to try to take that territory back. That may not be a popular proposition. There are people in Moldova who are pro-Russian too, but it would at least be a temptation anyway. Yeah, the bigger problem that I've read more recently in the past week is that if Moldova did end up in some kind of conflict with Russia, there could be an incentive for the Romanian government to get involved. Because for those of you who maybe are not familiar with Moldova, the people of Moldova are basically ethnic Romanians who were separated from the homeland by historical accident. Historically, the territory that comprises Moldova right now was known as Bessarabia, and it was annexed by the Russian Empire, I think, in like the 19th century, thereabouts. And so for 100 years or so, it was Russian territory, but then after World War I, there was some shenanigans in Russia. You probably heard of it, the October Revolution, the Russian Civil War, the purges, etc. So after World War I, Bessarabia was broken off from the Russian Empire as a result of the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, which was the peace treaty that the Bolsheviks signed with the German Empire that effectively knocked Russia out of the war. And as a part of that treaty, a whole bunch of Russia's western regions, specifically far western regions, were broken off and made either independent states or annexed by other territories. And the Germans had their own plans for those territories, but they ended up losing the war. So the Allies ended up having a much bigger impact on the future of those territories. So Bessarabia ended up being given basically to the state of Romania, to which it was returned. And it stayed so pretty much throughout the interwar years until, I want to say, 1940. I think everybody's heard of the Winter War, right? Which is when the Soviet Union invaded Finland. It went pretty poorly for them, even though they ended up winning in the end. But in that same year, I want to say, the Soviet Union also forcibly annexed Bessarabia, which again had been part of Romania for the previous 2 decades. And as a result of that, Bessarabia became a Soviet Socialist Republic again. Well, not again, but became a Soviet Socialist Republic. It was renamed the Moldovan Soviet Socialist Republic as part of an effort to try to reinforce a separate identity for the people of Moldova in order to try to tamper down any potential irredentist sentiment amongst the population that might see people try to demand the territory be returned to Romania. So Moldova, or more accurately, the Moldovan Soviet Socialist Republic, remained part of the Soviet Union throughout the Cold War until the collapse of the Soviet Union, whereupon it became an independent country. And there was some talk of Romania annexing the territory, but it never really happened. Romania kind of had its own problems, and Moldova itself had problems with Russian-populated regions in the east of the country that did not want to be a part of either Moldova or Romania, which was of concern there for the ethnic Russians. And so they tried to declare independence in the east of the country in a sliver of territory called the Transnistria Republic. And there was a pretty big Red Army, what was it, an arms depot, something like that, in which they stored a huge amount of weapons. And on the pretext of protecting that depot and on the pretext of providing peacekeepers to protect the ethnic Russians there, the Russians maintained a force of Russian military forces there after the country became independent and have maintained that force there ever since for basically the past 30 plus years. So that's the force that kind of people are watching right now as far as the war in Ukraine. Again, though, there's not very many of them, and any kind of action risks escalation that could involve the Romanian government, since they might want to help Moldova if they end up fighting the Russians. And of course, if Romania gets involved, then there's the risk of the war escalating to a NATO-Russia war, which of course brings the prospect of possible thermonuclear holocaust, which I don't think most people want at this point. Maybe there's some doomers online kind of look forward to it. But beyond that niche subgroup, I think most people are trying to avoid that as much as possible, up to and including the Russians, despite all of the various nuclear death threats that they've been issuing with some regularity for the past few weeks. So there's been that. But again, I don't think much will come of it. And we probably really won't know the truth behind the explosions until much later anyway.
Hmm.
But maybe I'm wrong, and maybe there's some excitement or further excitement in southeastern Europe. That would certainly escalate things if Moldova did get involved. Let's see, what else did we have here? There's been a lot of partisan activity, more so over the past month. Didn't really see it much in the first month or so of the war. What, February, March? But April seemed to see more of it. I guess it took some time for people to kind of get organized. But regardless, some of the stories I had here, one, I think we talked a little bit about this. There was the rail war in Belarus. A lot of people there have been sabotaging the rail network in Belarus to try to help hobble Russian logistics. I think we mentioned it last week or so.
Yeah,
But
we did talk about how their logistics is very reliant on rail, so that would make
yeah,
sense.
yeah, Russian logistics is heavily centered around rail networks. So it was a big deal then for their rail network, in so much as it extended through Belarus. It was a big deal for that to be disrupted, such as it was, by saboteurs and partisans of one sort or another. In this case, Belarusian saboteurs. There's a lot of people in Belarus that don't particularly like the government at this point, owing to the violent suppression of mass protests a few years ago. Well, actually, not even that late. It was 2021, wasn't it? So in 2021, let's say. And some of the residual impact of that is that people are not very enthusiastic about the Russian war in Ukraine and have been taking active measures, so to speak, to try to hobble the Russian effort. The Belarusian army, for its part, doesn't seem very interested either. There was apparently some pressure on the part of the Russian government for the Belarusian government to commit Belarusian armed forces to the conflict. And there was some movement of Belarusian army units towards the border, which led some people to suspect that they might be about to jump in. But they never did. And there were rumors spread on the internet. I don't know that they were ever confirmed, but there were rumors that Belarusian army units were refusing to fight. And it may be that the Belarusian government was concerned that it might lose the support of the army if they did force them to fight. So Belarusian armed forces, as is, despite being allied with Russia, have not been committed to the fight and do not look set to for the foreseeable future. So that's another illustration of the lack of public support for the war, either in the government or outside the government. And again, the impact has been a significant hobbling of Russian logistics, especially in northern Ukraine. I've even read somebody suggest that it could be that one of the main factors for Ukrainian victory there, beyond the own professionalism and success of the Ukrainian armed forces, was the fact that Russian logistics in northern Ukraine were just so utterly catastrophic. And we had been thinking that was mostly because of Ukrainian activity in the Russian rear, attacking undefended truck convoys. But it could also be that part of the reason supplies were having trouble reaching the Russian front was because of this issue with trains being sabotaged in Belarus. Also, there's been a whole kit and caboodle of arson in Russia. There's been a bunch of fires breaking out at various facilities, and that happens. It's not unusual, but it seems to be happening more frequently lately. and that has some people suspicious that maybe there are Russian saboteurs acting within Russia. I don't know that all of the targets have necessarily been military, but one of the lists I found on Twitter suggested among the targets has been a tank farm in Bryansk, a military base in Bryansk, a, a meat processing plant in Bryansk, a agro-prom complex in Bryansk. I don't know what that means. A house in St. Petersburg, an air base in Ussurisk, police stations in Moscow, Irkutsk, and Novosibirsk, and a shopping center in the suburbs, presumably in Moscow. And then there was also a 120 megawatt coal-fired power plant, which allegedly was sabotaged in Sakhalin in the Russian Far East. Pretty considerable loss there, if that was in fact knocked out for the short to medium term. Also, a number of military enlistment offices around Russia have been targeted. So there's been pretty significant uptick in activity in this regard within Russia. I don't think it's going to really deal a significant blow to the Russian military or to the war effort in Ukraine, but I guess it's just a reminder that there are a lot of people in Russia that do not like what is happening, even if they may not be able to necessarily voice that outwardly and publicly. Let's see, and we had some new information that I thought was interesting anyway about the Battle of Hostomel. This was I think it was like a town northwest of Kiev, and it was the location of an airfield that the Russians tried to take in the first couple days of the war. I think they were hoping to use the airfield to fly in, troops and equipment in order to expedite the seizure of the capital. But as was, the Russian paratroopers that were sent to secure the airport ended up defeated, and as a result, the Russians were not able to make much use out of the airport over the course of the Battle of Kiev. So there was some question about reports that the Ukrainians had managed to shoot down a couple of plane loads of paratroopers. So they claimed to have shot down a IL-76, which is a type of Russian transport plane that was chock full of paratroopers on their way to the airfield. And that's a pretty ugly loss if you're a paratrooper. It's bad enough getting shot down when you're sort of descending to the earth after doing a jump. It's even worse if you're shot down before you can even make the jump. So that happened once, and then allegedly it happened again. So 2 plane loads of Russian paratroopers apparently shot down and killed before even having the chance to join the fight. So some people were questioning whether or not that actually happened. The Ukrainians claimed it. The only reason I took it seriously is because there was a report in a newspaper quoting a unnamed anonymous government source in Washington who vouched for the Ukrainians on that. So I think it was like the Washington Post or something. It was a credible source. So I took it seriously for that reason. But more recently, there's been new info, and I think this adds a little more credibility to the story. Apparently, the CIA was involved in the downing of the transports. I was saying before that they were sharing information with the Ukrainians about air assets and air defense assets that were going to be targeted by the Russian Air Force. Apparently, they were also sharing lots of other types of information and have been, up to and including that Russian paratroopers were going to try to seize this airfield. So it could be that using this information, the Ukrainian air defense forces were able to successfully set up a kind of air defense ambush, if you like, and shoot down the transport planes. I know that sounds weird. You don't really think of air defense being something you have ambushes in, but it actually is something that you can do. In general, if you just have your radar on all the time trying to find targets, then what'll happen is that another force will detect the radar waves, and they'll fire what's called an anti-radiation missile, which are designed to home in on the source of radar emissions. And it's a quick and easy way to destroy a radar station, which effectively blinds surface-to-air missile systems. And what you can do is you can basically just turn the radar off and on, which I know sounds like some hacky IT shit, but it's true. What you do is that you turn on the radar when you think there's a threat around, you target anything that's available, fire a missile, and then you shut it off again. And then ideally you move the radar station. The Russians developed a whole family of mobile surface-to-air missile systems with mobile radar systems. So this isn't unusual for them. They've developed the technology, and Ukraine, of course, has a lot of that technology left over from the Soviet period. So what you do then is if you know that there's going to be an aircraft that you want to shoot down coming through a given area, what you can do is you can kind of lull them in by just basically not having an active air defense there, not having active radar or what have you. And then when you know they're overhead, then you can turn the radar on, shoot them down, and then turn it off again to avoid any kind of retaliation. So that's what I mean when I say air defense ambush. That's not a technical term, by the way. And if you have military experience, try not to laugh too hard when you listen to me make an attempt to explain this stuff. I myself do not have such a background, so I have to struggle with layman terminology as a result. Let's see. So
There
that
was
kind
a
of brings
question in
us.
the chat kind of related to this with hacking. There were some fires that occurred. They were asking what are the chances that these fires could have been initiated by someone hacking, say, a plant or something and causing it to overload or have some issue.
In the case of the power plant in Sakhalin, I could believe that. That's possible. But I don't know that some of the other locations are likely. Like a military recruitment office, for example, I don't think likely has anything you can hack that's going to set it on fire.
Yeah.
Those are just sort of office spaces. So in cases like that, probably not. In the case of some of the heavy industry that's been targeted, possibly. But that could also just be workers there, trying to commit acts of sabotage. It's a little hard to judge.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, certainly there's been a lot of hacking going on. It wasn't entirely clear what the Russians were doing as far as hacking. But in the past couple weeks, there's been more information on that, and apparently there was a pretty large-scale effort by Russian hackers, either private or state affiliated, to try to attack Ukraine, both in the lead up to the invasion and in the first month or so of the invasion. They apparently went after communications networks in particular, as well as military facilities, as well as government offices and agencies. Some of that was deflected with the assistance of Western forces. I'm not sure what to call them. Anti-hacking groups within Western governments of one sort or another. Somebody in chat maybe can help me out with the technical term for that. I guess technically they're soldiers because they're generally part of military branches of one sort or another. But at the same time, it seems weird to call hackers soldiers. I trust somebody with more experience would know better than I would.
You've heard of Space Force, but have you heard of Cyber Force?
There's got to be something like that. I know certainly the intelligence agencies have their own sort of versions of that, but I'm not sure about the military. Excuse me. So let's see, that brings us to the Donbass offensive. So I had some notes on that. It started April the 18th, more or less officially. That's significant because from what I'd been reading, it was expected to start later. And so that kind of suggests that they're rushing it a little bit. What they had been doing is taking the forces that had been redeployed from northern Ukraine, and the idea is to try to reconstitute them, re-up them, rearm them, and then redeploy them into eastern Ukraine for the Donbass offensive. But while that has happened, it's happened way faster than people expected. So I guess hypothetically it's possible they were able to refit all those units very quickly, but from what I've read, it seems unlikely. It seems more likely they did a rush job, basically, and just combined a whole bunch of units that had been just absolutely hammered over the course of the fighting in northern Ukraine and tried to get them more or less to fighting strength in that fashion, and then just threw them into Donbass as quickly as possible. And one of the ideas that I read, one of the explanations for that I read, which actually does make some sense, is that the Russians are not necessarily being stupid here. They've done some stupid things thus far, so that was my immediate assumption. But actually, it may be a strategic decision. Because one of the things happening that it's very easy to see if you've been following the news, is that the West, again, Europe and the United States and Canada have been significantly increasing the material support, both in terms of value and effectiveness, that they've been sending to Ukraine. And that means that the Russians are a little bit on the clock because, the longer the war draws out, basically, the more combat effective and well armed the Ukrainian army is going to be. So it could be that the Russian army has been tasked with trying to conquest of the two provinces in the far east of Ukraine, Donetsk and Luhansk, relatively quickly before the Ukrainian army can receive a lot of this new aid that they're getting, and before they can field it in a way that's going to significantly hobble Russian military efforts in the future. If the Russian government can successfully seize those territories, then the Russian government can basically declare victory and go home. They can say that really the only thing they'd wanted to do was to try to liberate, quote unquote, Donetsk and Luhansk and protect the ethnic Russians living there from, quote unquote, Ukrainian Nazis. And once they've secured those territories, they can basically just hold the territory they've taken and condition withdrawal from southern Ukraine on Ukrainian recognition of the independence of Donetsk and Luhansk. Now, this plan kind of implies that the Ukrainians are going to negotiate. That may not happen. The Ukrainian government has a veto here. If they want to keep fighting, they can do so. And so that could make things difficult for the Russian government if they do prolong the war. Because the Russian economy is not in the best shape right now. They're probably more resilient to sanctions than people give them credit for. But that said, the longer the war goes, the more expense that the Russian government is piling up, because again, war is expensive. But also the more difficulty they're going to have replacing units that are taking both human and material losses in Ukraine. One of the rumors I've heard is that the Russian government may, if the war is still going on May 9th, which is like their Armed Forces Day, the Russian government may take the opportunity to basically mobilize the nation for war, which would be a big move because Russia can mobilize upwards of 2 million men from their reserves if they want to, and get them into the army and deploy them. That's not entirely a credible threat, though, because I've also read criticism of that idea predicated on the fact that mobilization itself is going to be an expensive process. It's going to take time, and also it's going to require the Russian bureaucracy to be something other than utterly inflexible, which normally they are. So those three factors suggest that mobilization maybe is not in the cards, since it would be a problem logistically, if not also politically, since they're not technically at war still. The Russian government is still going out of their way to maintain that fiction. But even beyond that, even if they do decide to mobilize, it's going to take probably several months for them to actually fully mobilize all those people, or even to mobilize a significant number of them. Keep in mind, if you're going to mobilize 2 million people, that doesn't just mean that you get men to come to a barrack somewhere and then, recognize them as being part of the army. It also means you have to arm them, you have to clothe them, you have to feed them, you have to pay them. You have to do all of the logistical stuff that goes into supplying a soldier. And 2 million men is a lot, even for Russia, which has a lot of equipment in sort of storage, in their inventory that they could break out. But, while sort of the weight of numbers would definitely be a factor, it remains the case that even so, Russia would in this case effectively be telling, if not forcing, 2 million relatively untrained conscripts, whom would likely be equipped with relatively old equipment, which would probably not be very effective in a modern context, and flinging them at a relatively and rapidly modernizing, what is a relatively modern army and which is a rapidly modernizing army on the Ukrainian side. And that's not going to end well for them. I mean, even if they're able to take territory and get some wins by sheer weight of numbers, or maybe just by attacking from, multiple directions at once, they're going to take really bad losses. One of the things I've heard from some of the recorded conversations from Russian soldiers is that they're really getting the sense that Russian command does not give a shit about them on an individual basis. They complain about bodies of dead comrades being just sort of left out in the field, uncollected. They complain about people who are just left behind, guys that maybe get lost during an operation and then just aren't really collected again. There was a specific conversation I heard in which a guy was complaining that two soldiers disappeared. They didn't know why. They supposedly ran away when they were under fire from mortars. But then they received a order to withdraw. And so the whole unit withdrew without finding these lost guys. Like, they didn't know if they were alive or dead or what the deal was. And that apparently has also damaged morale. Things like this are not even this is just an isolated example, but they've also been allegedly happening in other units. So taking those kinds of losses is definitely not going to hurt what is also a pretty disastrous morale situation in the Russian army. And that's going to have increasingly dire effects on combat effectiveness. I mean, there's already been reports of units that were comprised of conscripts that early in the war that were comprised of conscripts that were not supposed to fight and did not want to fight, basically just abandoning their equipment and positions when they came under attack by the Ukrainian army. So that could happen hypothetically more frequently if a larger percentage of the army becomes conscripts. It bodes ill well for the future of the Russian armed forces in Ukraine, suffice to say.
Yeah, I think a big part of people being galvanized by conflict is feeling like you have some sort of unity within the group or the nation or whoever is engaging in combat. And if you are basically just meat for the meat grinder, it's not very attractive to jump into the fray. Like if they really don't
Yeah.
care, I think a lot of people are willing to risk for their homeland because they feel like it's their duty and also that they're going to be honored for that sacrifice if they have to make the ultimate sacrifice. Uh, just seeing what happens to other soldiers, I think, has, like you're saying, a pretty big morale effect on the current soldiers or the potential future soldiers.
Yeah, it's kind of a downer. I mean, in terms of combat effectiveness, it doesn't really matter if you just let dead soldiers lie out in the sun without trying to get them back to their families. But, if you already feel like your commanders don't particularly care about you, the prospect that your body is going to just end up rotting out somewhere, in the wilderness, it just kind of weighs on you a little bit. Like, what are you going to be dying for,
Yeah.
if commanders don't give a shit about you? Like, what's the point of it?
You feel a lot more like a tool than like a person.
Yeah.
I think
Yeah. And
that's
some
one
of
of
the,
the things that Zelensky has done really well, which is basically the stark contrast here of calling the people who fight for Ukraine heroes and really elevating them and lifting them up and talking about the tenacity and their good ability and stuff. Russia is doing a similar thing where they're talking up the like bravery of their soldiers and that kind of a thing, but the flip side is the support that you give them says a lot about how much you actually care. Like you can say that you really love someone and you care about them, but for that to feel real, you have to do stuff that supports that claim rather than just making the claim and then disregarding them later on. Like people are going to figure it out eventually. I think that's one of the aspects that the US, I think, has a pretty high premium on, and maybe some other countries do a similar thing where they try more of a no man left behind strategy. And if you do have a unit missing, you make it a very, very high priority to recover that person or at least to figure out what happened to them.
yeah, that's been practiced for a long time,
Mm-hmm.
especially in American and Western European militaries. Seems like a good policy.
Yeah, certainly if you're one of the fighters.
Yeah. Let's see. Some other notes here. Syrian and Libyan fighters were actually confirmed in Ukraine, fighting for the Russians, of course. So it seems they were able to follow through on that. There had been talk for a while that they would try to make up for manpower shortages amongst the Russian armed forces in Ukraine by recruiting quote unquote volunteers from various Russian aligned countries, specifically in the Middle East. Syria and Libya were among them, and it seems they actually did send some forces to fight. Probably cannon fodder. That's how they were used in Azerbaijan anyway. So I suspect it's not going to be much different here. Let's see. As for specific battles thus far, I don't know how closely people listening have been following the Donbass offensive, if not the war in general. But the two big battles right now in the Donbass offensive are the Battle of Rubizhnya and the Battle of Popasna. And those are two cities that are basically in the way, so to speak, of two of the major axes of advance for Russian forces trying to move into Donbass, or at least what of Donbass they haven't already taken. If I'm not mistaken, and please correct me if I'm wrong, Rubizhnya is in the, I want to say the east of the eastern part. It's the well, basically, Popasna is in the northern part part of the area of operations, and then Rubizhne is in the eastern part. So there's some Ukrainian separatist forces, as well as probably Russian army forces, that are trying to push west from the line of control that was established between the separatist republics and the Ukrainian army back in 2014, 2015. And they've had very little progress. It's been very hard going for them. As well as the Ukrainian army has performed in the rest of the country, the Ukrainian army units in the eastern territories in and around Donbass, where the separatists or have been since 2014, those units are actually the best units in the Ukrainian army. And they've been in those positions for the past 8 years, which means not only are they very, very familiar with the layout of the land, it also means they've been fortifying them over that time period. Well, I guess it doesn't inherently mean they've been fortifying, but they have been. The Ukrainian army has been fortifying that territory for the past 8 years. So they're well prepared for fighting there. And they're actually in a pretty good position to deflect a major Russian offensive. I read, a couple days ago that the Ukrainians are actually outnumbered 2-1 in the Donbass. So the odds are a little bit stacked against them in that sense, but they seem to be carrying those odds pretty well, so to speak. They seem to be holding their own thus far. The Russians have been making gains, but not considerable gains, at least not yet. I've also read that the Ukrainians have been fighting a defensive maneuver. So rather than just trying to hold fixed positions, they'll have kind of a screening force up front. And then attacking forces will move through that, and then the Ukrainians will mobilize a mobile reserve, which then attacks the units that are moving forward. So even though the Russians do take some territory, the Ukrainians frequently take it back because of this approach to defensive warfare. It's pretty smart, and it also economizes the few forces that they have, since if they tried to have a fixed line of defense all along the line of contact, they would have to spread their forces pretty thin.
Yeah, there's a similar principle with how you can play in StarCraft where you might have a base location, but you can just yield that base location and pull all the troops away from it and just keep your army alive and then choose to take a fight later on at a different location. And that's generally preferable to just losing the whole set of troops in one go. It's harder to replace all of those than it is to just replace the town hall structure. It's like, okay, yeah, you have a big attack here. We can't really win this fight, or at least not in a very good way, so we're just going to let you take this, and we're going to move our forces somewhere else, and then we'll fight you later with a better position.
Yeah. Yeah, it's what you do when you're outnumbered. So Ukrainians have been making use of a similar principle there. So I mentioned the battles of Rubizhne, Popasna. There was also a third battle, the Battle of Izium. That's already over, and the Russians won that. That was a part of the initial thrust south, which is north of the area that they've been trying to encircle. They were able to win that battle, but they've since been hung up on Popasna, which is to the south of Izium, I believe. Again, if I'm wrong, please correct me. I'm having some trouble remembering which was which, but I believe that's accurate. Let's see, some other notes here. The Russians, like I mentioned earlier, are doing a little better in the Donbass offensive as far as some of the sort of abstract factors that go into a military operation. So command and control, air support, intelligence, these are all performing much better for the Russians, at least thus far in Donbass. For example, what I read and what's in my notes here, they adopted a quote-unquote sounder pattern of operational movement in eastern Ukraine, at least along the line from Izium to Rubizhne, end quote. So rather than just sort of flinging units at the enemy and hoping that they don't fight back like they did like in the first week of the war, now they're actually sort of being more ginger and careful. You don't have these big sweeping movements like you saw before. Now they're incrementally trying to take territory, and where they meet resistance, they try to apply their superior artillery in order to try to break resistance. So they've been slower and more methodical in that sense, and that's been more to their favor. I've also read that Russian air support is a lot more present in the Donbass offensive than it was in the rest of the country. So that's also a big advantage for them. Air support is always very useful. And they also have the advantage of multiple lines of advance this time. So rather than just having like one line of advance in each theater like they had before, now they're focusing most of their forces in the one theater and they're focusing them along two lines of advance in order to force the Ukrainians to try to split their defensive forces. So that's smarter than what they were doing before. It still may not work, just for the reason that at a tactical level, the Russian armed forces are maybe not up to the task. If they weren't before, then like I mentioned, they're certainly so now, given that they're having to work with second tier units and equipment at this point. Let's see.
There was a quick question in the chat about whether the foreign support and response toward the Russian aggression would change if Russia formally declared it a war.
I don't know the degree to which the West would escalate its involvement, but I think they definitely would if Russia did that. You know, it's one thing for there to be a special military operation, as the Russians call it, but a formal declaration of war would change the context. The West is already going pretty far out of its way to prop up the Ukrainians. And like I said, they didn't really think they would even get this far. And so they're having to kind of adjust their approach to supporting Ukraine to reflect the fact that Ukraine could conceivably win a conventional war against Russia, which I really can't understate how shocking that is. That really kind of blew everybody's mind all over the analytical community, or at least what of them I've been reading. But you can see the change sort of reflected in the types of equipment that the West is giving and the change in the rhetoric and the change in the rules. Like one of the things I've got in my notes that I was going to get to later, intelligence agencies in the United States were not allowed at the beginning of the conflict to share information with Ukraine that they could use to hypothetically attack Russian territory. Because at that stage of the conflict, we were still mostly focused on preventing the conflict from escalating to involve the West. And we didn't really think that was an issue because we didn't really think the Ukrainians could actually hold them off. But now it seems they can, and since that's become apparent, one of the changes has been that restrictions on the sharing of such intelligence have ended. And so there's been a corresponding uptick over the past month in targets within Russia that have been hit by Ukrainians. There was, of course, the famous raid on the oil depot in, what was it, Belgorod province, I think it's called. I think somebody on the YouTube comment thought I was trying to say Belgrade, so I'm probably mispronouncing it. So my apologies, but I want to say it's pronounced Belgorod Oblast. It's the oblast that's like immediately northeast of Ukraine, basically within Russia. So there was an oil depot there that was attacked by a pair of Ukrainian helicopters, and it seems that there's been similar attacks just across the border. It's not entirely clear exactly who's responsible because the Ukrainian government has been very cagey about taking responsibility. Technically, they didn't even take responsibility for the oil depot raid. They said that actually it wasn't them, but they also said that it was basically karma for the invasion and kind of went out of their way to insult the Russians. So that kind of hinted that they were actually responsible without fully taking credit for it. So it seems that the Ukrainians have been much more aggressive in attacking targets within Russia over the past month in particular. And it seems like the ending of the restrictions on Western intelligence sharing with Ukraine are partly at least responsible for that, which itself represents an escalation, which itself represents how the Western approach is changing here. So that said, you may wonder, well, how would a Russian declaration of war really change anything if the West is already escalating support to Ukraine? Well, there's still lots more we could do, and there's always possibility of direct intervention, which is not impossible. I know, like, everybody and their mother has been talking, including me for that matter, has been talking about how the West's principal strategy here, beyond just supporting Ukraine and punishing Russia, to deter future types of aggression that might be similarly modeled not only in Europe but in other parts of the world. The other key component of Western strategy is to avoid escalation to a possible nuclear exchange, which means preventing any kind of direct involvement of Western forces with Russian forces as far as combat goes. That could change in the right circumstances. So if it becomes apparent, for example, that Russia does not see Ukraine as worth a nuclear war, then intervention becomes much more likely. Because right now, the only reason the West is concerned about intervening is they are not entirely sure that the Russian government would not respond with conventional nuclear weapons to a NATO intervention of some kind. But if there is some kind of intelligence or other reason to think that Russian strategy is such that the use of conventional nuclear weapons in response to intervention is unlikely, if not impossible, then intervention becomes more likely. And while we can't rule it out entirely that the Russians would not use conventional nuclear weapons in response to an intervention, I would point out that, again, it's a pretty bold move to do that. And keep in mind, it's not just the West that's worried about escalation to a nuclear exchange. The Russian government is also concerned about that. You may not know it by how they talk about nuking countries that might think about intervening. There's obviously a lot of death threats being issued. But at the same time, if you're the Russian government, do you really want to glass Russia or get Russia glassed, more accurately, because of a failed invasion of Ukraine? Is that really worth it to you? So maybe it is. There's certainly no shortage of Russian nationalists in government, and I think there's a lot of uncertainty there. But I don't think it's a guarantee that it is. And so again, if that calculus were to become less ambiguous, then you could actually see Western intervention. So the reason I bring that up in reference to this question, again, the question is, if Russia declares war on Ukraine, does that suggest the possibility of escalation by the West? It definitely does, but I would argue that intervention at that point is a possibility. It's not a foregone conclusion, but neither do I think it can be completely ruled out.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it would be, I don't think anybody in the West has threatened that thus far. I don't think there's even been any hints that the West might intervene in that case. But at the same time, it opens a door. Like, if Russia escalates, then tit for tat, the West will escalate, and we may just happen to decide that it's time for some kind of intervention. Also, keep in mind when I say intervention, that doesn't mean like full on balls to the wall. We're going to invade Ukraine. Well, not invade Ukraine, but we're going to jump into Ukraine and eject all Russian forces from Ukraine. We're going to invade Crimea. We're going to have Crimean War 2.0. We're going to have all this drama. No, it doesn't necessarily have to be that. You could have a limited intervention. One of the proposals I saw, like in the first month of the war, which was proposed by, I think, a couple Eastern European countries, was to send quote unquote peacekeepers into Ukraine. And I think the idea there nominally was to try to send those forces into some of the disputed territory and possibly create some room for the two sides to negotiate a peaceful outcome. I don't think that was ever particularly likely, but if you wanted to do something similar where you just send peacekeepers into territory that is not yet contested, for example, say northern Ukraine or western Ukraine, you could send forces there, and then by doing so, free up Ukrainian forces that are garrisoned there to go and fight in the east, and in that way help the Ukrainians dedicate a larger percentage of their available army to the actual fight rather than protecting against, saboteurs or whatever garrison forces in Western Ukraine have been doing. It also creates a tripwire there, wherein if Russian forces do get ambitious and try to invade northern Ukraine again or western Ukraine, then they would face the prospect of triggering a conflict with those forces. So the peacekeepers don't have to be aggressive. They can just sort of exist there as a deterrent to future aggression in the territories on which they're operating. This actually is not entirely unprecedented because Turkey actually did this in Syria, specifically northern Syria, in the territories where they're backing rebels against the Syrian government. There's been a lot of fighting and hewing and hawing on the part of Turkey as far as how involved they would be in the conflict. But eventually the rebels started losing ground and there was a ceasefire. But part of the ceasefire was conditioned on Turkey trying to do more to remove jihadist rebels from the territory that they de facto controlled. And that was not entirely feasible. The Turks technically control the proxies in that territory, but there's a lot that they don't really control, or at least that have substantial autonomy. And the result of the jihadists not being terribly cooperative to Turkish requests for them to vacate the territory was that that precondition was unmet. And so the Syrians responded to that by launching an invasion of the rebel-held territory with an eye towards reconquering all of it. And this broke the ceasefire, even though the preconditions hadn't been met, the Syrians and the Russians had been honoring it. So that broke the ceasefire, and it raised the prospect of the rebel territory being rolled up from the south. And, part of the problem they faced is that they didn't entirely have Russian support. They usually enjoyed Russian air support at least, but in this case, the Russians were not entirely happy about it. They were kind of moving towards a policy of trying to keep Syria quiet to a degree. And so they didn't get the support they wanted from the Russians, but more importantly, the Turks got involved. They sent in the Turkish army. And the idea there was to basically use the Turkish army as a shield. They set up outposts and forward operating bases and basically dared the Syrian army to attack them, knowing full well that if they did, there would be massive retaliation from the Turkish military, which has its problems, but is much more powerful than any other army in the Middle East. And even if the Russian army may be more powerful in some regards, the Russian contingent within Syria certainly would not have been able to hold them off if the Turks had really gone after them. So this idea of sort of just putting your forces amidst fighting without participating in the fighting as a kind of deterrent, that has precedent. So hypothetically, NATO quote-unquote peacekeepers could fulfill a similar role as a part of a kind of limited intervention that could itself be a kind of retaliation against a Russian declaration of war. So this is the kind of limited intervention I'm thinking of. And there's a whole range of limited interventions that NATO could engage in that are either more or less escalatory than the one that I highlighted. So I think Russia kind of knows that this is a possibility, and that if they declare war, it kind of opens the door for this kind of activity. It's not guaranteed. It could be that the West just does nothing. It could be that, well, maybe not nothing, but it could be that the escalation on the part of the West is not any greater than the degree of escalation that we've seen thus far. So in that sense, it could just stay on trend. But at the same time, why let a crisis go to waste, so to speak? If the Russians do escalate, then why not escalate our own involvement? So intervention is on the table, is basically the long-winded, circuitous argument I'm trying to make here.
Short answer to their question, yes.
Yes, there will be.
Yeah. The question is,
yes.
What extent?
Yeah, the extent is unclear, and we shouldn't really rule anything out.
Mm.
Yeah, it's not just the West that has to worry about escalation, it's also Russia. So I doubt that they would do that, but at the same time, it could be that the Russian government is getting desperate enough to try to make what we would call in America some Hail Mary passes.
Mm-hmm.
That's sort of like a last-ditch desperate move in a football game. You absolutely need to take a high-risk, high-reward play. So that's possible, at least. Meandering answers with John Smith.
We're good at those. We're good at tangents as well.
Let's see. Oh, another note here on the Donbass offensive. There's apparently been heavy rain in the region recently, and that's apparently been hampering their progress. Not just because it causes the ground to be muddy and whatnot, but also because apparently the Russian army isn't very good at fighting in the rain. I don't know if that's true. That sounds a little outlandish, but there was a quote-unquote official who was quoted as saying as much from one of the analytical guys I read on Twitter. So I thought it was worth throwing in there. I don't know how that could be possible. I don't understand what kind of special equipment you really need to fight in the rain. I would think that would be something pretty much any modern military would be able to do.
Military-grade umbrellas.
Oh, maybe that's it. I don't know. But I thought that was an interesting note anyway. Anybody who knows more about it, or who knows it's bullshit, as the case may be, please let me know. I'm curious about it. Let's see. Also worth noting, the Russian military is still not really going off-road. They've mostly still restricted their operations to individual roads, which, again, as we've said before on here, makes their operations pretty predictable. Well, it makes their movements relatively predictable. Which makes it much easier to ambush them and to kind of bottleneck them in given areas where their logistics chains are vulnerable. We doing okay on time?
Yep, we're at about 2 hours. There was a question if there's been any escalation between Russia and Japan. There was some dispute over the islands between them. All that I
Not yet.
saw with that was that ships were being driven aggressively in areas that people didn't like them. And that's I think, fairly standard practice. It's one that anyone who's played any Civ game or any 4X builder knows of. If you park your like heavy hitting military stuff right next to people, they usually send you a message of like, what the fuck, bro? Why
Yeah.
are you here with this very aggressive set of stuff?
Yeah, I don't think that's an issue for now. Again, I think it's mostly just posturing. It's tying down a couple thousand Russian troops who might otherwise be in Ukraine. Actually, a lot of Russian Far Eastern troops have been redeployed at this point. So, it's a non-trivial number of troops to tie down. But beyond that, I don't think that there's going to be a conflict there. Although, actually, I was reading one of the FSB whistleblower letters recently. Apparently, he's still been making those. I thought there had only been four, but apparently people just kind of stopped reporting them. But there's been others, up to 20 now. So I'm a little bit behind on the FSB whistleblower letters at this point as a result. But one of the more recent ones I was reading, and again, I would point out that it's kind of hard to determine the veracity of these letters. So, we can't be 100% sure this is an actual FSB agent writing about what's happening. But some of the stuff has actually come true. For example, he was writing about a potential false flag attack in Moldova, and lo and behold, there were some explosions in the Transnistria Republic. So it could be there's some substance to them. And there was some substance to the earlier predictions that he had made, about May being a kind of de facto deadline, for example. That's kind of come up a lot and been more or less confirmed at this point. So whether or not you want to lend them credibility is kind of up to the individual listener, but I think they're at least interesting. And one of the interesting things I read recently, and I think it was like the 19th or the 20th letter or something, he was saying that a couple years, well, not even a couple years ago, last year, at 2021, there was apparently some push within the Russian government to fight some kind of conflict over the Kuril Islands. There was like a big, maybe not disinformation campaign, but a big campaign of slander against Japan. There was like a release of some documents that had been released from an archive, talking about Japanese atrocities against, Russian troops and Allied troops in World War II, something like that. And apparently, Russian media kind of really went full tilt and trying to kind of get people riled up about Japan and whatnot. And this was sort of at the same time that the Japanese government was kind of pushing hard to try to engage with Russia to try to hold some kind of negotiation over the Kuril Islands, and also to try to get some kind of peace treaty done. For those who maybe don't know this trivia, Japan and Russia never signed a peace treaty after World War II, so technically they're actually still at war, as crazy as that may sound. So it's not just the Kuril Islands that Japan negotiates with Russia over as far as disputes. They also would like to formally and legally bring a close to World War II. No surprise. But unfortunately, it's been a rather elusive prize, as the case has proven. So there was a push by Japan to try to resolve these issues, but it never really went anywhere. And apparently, there was some push within the Russian government to try to exploit some of the negative public perception of Japan stemming from all the bad press, and to kind of try a wag the dog situation, basically, where they start a conflict so that they can so that the government can enjoy a rally around the flag effect amongst the population, basically as a way to try to re-legitimize the government and rebuild public support for the government, by having something resembling a short victorious war. So that was the allegation made in the letter. Apparently, they ended up not doing this, not propagating the conflict or instigating it, as the case may be, because of the Afghan catastrophe for the United States. There was the whole boondoggle with the withdrawal of U.S. forces and the collapse of the of the allied Afghan state within Afghanistan. And apparently, the concern amongst the Russians, according to the letter anyway, was that the United States might welcome a conflict between Japan and Russia over the Kuril Islands, because that would give them an excuse to intervene in the conflict as a distraction for the government from the failure in Afghanistan. And so for that reason, it was thought that an American intervention would have been very likely and very credible, and a credible threat, such that a conflict with Japan was eventually just scrapped. They just decided that it wasn't worth the effort. And it's a pretty crazy story. I don't entirely know if that's all accurate. It seems like a stretch to think Russia would actually try to instigate a conflict over just some islands that aren't even that populated or worthwhile to the north of Japan. But at the same time, I didn't think that they'd really jump into Ukraine like they have either. So I guess we live in crazy times, and in crazy times, you can't really rule out crazy possibilities.
Yeah, I think I remember. We've been doing world discussion for a long time, so we definitely had some episodes where we were talking about the troop movements around the border of Ukraine, and the general consensus was, man, this is a really expensive posture. Do we think they're gonna go for it? Nah, probably not. That would be crazy. Holy shit, they're going for it. Okay, and then most people assumed, yeah, Russia's gonna win. It's a much larger country, higher population. They have a much greater emphasis on military and that kind of a thing. Oh shit, Ukraine is actually holding out. So it's definitely been a conflict of plenty of surprises.
Yep. And there's been no shortage of surprises over the past 5 to 10 years. It's kind of been one after another. It's that kind of era.
Yep.
Although at least the latest surprise was a pleasant surprise, unlike some of the other ones. Nice to have a little good news for once, at least.
Mm-hmm.
Let's see, what else do we have here? I already mentioned that it was rushed, so I guess that kind of rounds out the Donbass offensive nodes. What else did we have here? Some other interesting tidbits. We already talked about Western aid. We already talked about artillery. Did I mention Rheinmetall at all?
I don't know what that is.
That's a German defense company. I think they make tanks, specifically Leopard tanks, which are considered some of the better tanks in the world. So the German government has been notoriously evasive about supporting Ukraine. In general, rhetorically, they've been very supportive. And certainly they've been very proactive in trying to mitigate dependency on Russian natural gas, or at least they have been since the war started anyway. They're not really considering a cutoff, but I don't really entirely blame them for that, given how large their economy and how disruptive a short-term cutoff in natural gas would be. So fair enough on that count. But in terms of actual material support, they haven't really been sending as much as they might. In their defense, part of the problem is that most of the impetus in the first month and change of the war was on sending them equipment that their forces already knew how to use. Because again, it wasn't expected that the war would be very long. It was thought that they would collapse, or at least that they would not last more than like a couple weeks. So it was thought that any kind of material aid that should be sent should be stuff that they could receive and use very quickly. And as a result, Germany had a problem because they didn't really have a whole lot of old Soviet stuff in their inventory. They did have some old stuff left over from their East German inventory. East Germany was obviously a part of the Eastern Bloc during the Cold War, and so they still had some residual Cold War Soviet stuff in their inventory. But beyond that, they didn't have nearly as much available that kind of met requirements as far as quick and easy use than, say, Estonia or Poland or what have you, or some of these other Eastern European countries whose inventory is almost completely, or at least is in large part, former Soviet in nature. So some people have criticized the German government for that, for continuing that policy, even though it's become apparent the war is going to last longer, that the Ukrainian state is probably going to hold out, and is going to need heavy weaponry going forward if it does want to actually win the war. And so the German government has given excuses like, for example, that there's a lot of bureaucracy about clearing units for release to Ukraine. More recently, there was some tanks they were going to send, but then Switzerland said that they were not going to allow them to because apparently the ammunition for the weapons was Swiss in nature, and apparently the Swiss have this kind of provision where they will restrict the sale of weapons that they sell to a buyer in so much as who they can give that to. in terms of a third party. That's a very convoluted sentence. Let me try that again. The Swiss place restrictions on who the buyers of their material can share that material with. So basically, there are restrictions on third party recipients to the goods, specifically the defense related goods that the Swiss sell. I don't know how stringent they are to countries in, say, like Africa they might sell to. I suspect they're a little more liberal with how they apply the rules in that case. But as far as European buyers, apparently they're more strict about it. And the reason that the Swiss government says that they're activating this provision is that they say they want to defend their neutrality, which I'm a little skeptical about given how much they've participated in the sanctions regime against Russia thus far. It kind of seems like the neutrality ship has sailed at this point. You might as well jump in with everybody else, but I guess the Swiss government doesn't feel like that. I don't know if Eche Fatum is listening, but if he is, certainly his input would be appreciated on this subject. I've actually emailed with him a little bit over Russia, and one of the things he pointed out is that he doesn't completely understand how Switzerland can claim to be neutral despite selling so many weapons to so many different countries around the world. But
It's neutral with a very large asterisk.
yeah, it's got a little bit of an asterisk there. Well, anyway, this is all an explanation to kind of get around to Rheinmetall. So Rheinmetall is a major defense firm in Germany, and they themselves actually have some old Leopard 1 tanks. The Leopard 2 is the more modern one. That's the one that Germany has in service and that other countries have in service. But some of the older models are still in the defense firm's own inventory. And they've actually responded to criticism of the German government dragging its feet on heavy weapons support to Ukraine by saying that they themselves would, of their own volition, voluntarily send some of their old tanks to Ukraine, which was a pretty bold move for a company to make. The German government probably will inhibit some of that. There's probably going to be some of the usual bureaucracy there that will apply that will slow down the process. But the German government hasn't come out and said that they won't stop it from it. Well, the German government hasn't come out and said that they'll stop it from happening either. So that suggests that possibly Ukraine could have some Leopard 1s on the way. And again, they're older tanks. I think they're like 60s, 70s vintage tanks or so. Somebody more familiar with tanks can maybe clarify that for me in chat. But that said, a lot of the equipment that Russia is using is also older equipment. And even amongst their newer stuff, a lot of the crews are apparently not really all that well trained or motivated. So even if Ukraine is getting some of the older stuff, they may make up for the age of the equipment with motivation, training, and good doctrine. So it could be that Ukrainians are going to be able to hit back pretty strongly if they can actually get a lot of this stuff. Rheinmetall was talking about sending up to 50 used Leopard 1 tanks, which doesn't sound like a lot, but it's actually a pretty decent number. You can do some damage with that. Let's see. Oh, and as far as involvement in the conflict, this is another interesting note on that count, as far as the West being involved in the conflict. In the first month and a half, I want to say, maybe the first 2 months or so, the West was very clear about not having personnel on the ground. Like even the advisors and other personnel they'd had in Ukraine before the war started were evacuated when it became apparent that an invasion was imminent. Now they're starting to back off of that a little bit. So I was reading an article, I think a week or two ago, about an SAS deployment to Ukraine, whom apparently are training Ukrainians in how to use the in-law, which is a type of British anti-tank. I want to say rocket. Maybe it's a missile. I'm not sufficiently familiar with all the different types of anti-tank missiles that are in Ukraine. It kind of feels like they have all of them at this point. So in this case, the weapon in question is British in origin, and apparently the SAS has actually sent officers into Ukraine to train Ukrainians on its proper usage. So that's not a big deal per se, but it's significant in so much as it represents actual Western boots on the ground in Ukraine. And that kind of goes back to what I was kind of rambling about before about the possibility of Western intervention being unlikely, but also non-zero. Now let's see. Yeah, we already talked about that. So a little note here about production. So the US has kind of blown through its inventory of Javelin anti-tank missiles at this point. I think we've got some left, but we're sending more and more of them. So the question now is, can we produce enough to meet demand in Ukraine? Ukraine is probably demanding more than they need, just so that they can have lots in reserve. But if fighting continues, they're going to need more eventually. So there's a question about whether or not we can continue that supply chain of anti-tank missiles. So let's see, from what I've read anyway in my notes here, so there's been some 7,000 javelins given to Ukraine thus far. And I might add this information is probably a couple weeks old by now. And that represented about a third of the total American inventory. And the author of the article in question, who was a speaker at the CSIS, the Center for Strategic and International Studies, said that it would take about 3 to 4 years to replace that inventory. And again, that's about 7,000 javelins. So that suggests that production capacity is not really there for mass production anyway. 3 to 4 years is a long time to replace that many, and we've already we've already sent that many in just a couple months. So I suspect there's going to be a push here to try to get the manufacturer to significantly draw up production, not only to replace U.S. inventory, but to ensure that there's a steady supply in the event that the war is prolonged. Which, again, I would argue is unlikely, but it's possible. You kind of have to plan for that. You especially have to plan for it because it's actually a signal. If you take steps that implicitly assume that the war is going to be over soon, then that incentivizes the Russians to try to prolong the war as much as possible, because they may suspect that the West is getting basically bored of the conflict. They may suspect we're getting disinterested. So it's important then to try to take steps that signal that we do expect the war to possibly at least be prolonged, and that we're taking steps to be prepared for that. That signals that we're committed for the long term, regardless of whether the conflict is short term or long term. So that shows the Russians were committed, that we're not going to get disinterested, and that if they're smart, that they'll come to some kind of negotiated solution instead of battering their head against a wall for the next however many months they want to continue fighting. Let's see. And then there was the new drone we're sending them. This is all in the aid section. This is all about basically support we're giving to Ukraine. So the new system we're sending them is a UAV, an unmanned aerial vehicle called the Phoenix Ghost. Oh, that's it, the Phoenix Ghost. And the government has been a little cagey about just what exactly it does. It was apparently developed by U.S. intelligence agencies. But from what little I was able to find about it, it can take off vertically, so no surprise, it's basically a drone. It's got a 6+ hour endurance time in which it can search for and track targets. It has an infrared sensor, so it can operate at night, which is pretty handy. And it's also apparently effective against quote-unquote medium armored targets. So that's more powerful. That is a more powerful loitering munition, if we want to call it that, than the Switchblade drones that we were giving Ukraine and have been giving Ukraine. The Switchblades we've been sending are basically Model 1, and the second model is kind of more designed for an anti-tank role. The Model 1s can't really be used against armored targets. They're more for softer targets like people or maybe trucks or something like that. So to send them a drone that can target armored vehicles, albeit ones with only medium armor, that's a significant step up there in capacity. And also the ability to operate at night is also a big plus. So it seems we're stepping up our aid game, not only in terms of artillery and whatnot, but also sending them more sophisticated drones / loitering munitions. There's kind of a fine line between them. Let's see. And then there was that. Yeah. So yeah, I guess that's all I had on the aid section. And then there's been more news on the occupation. This is something that I've been trying to keep tabs on. So one of the questions I had when the conflict started is what Russian occupation of Ukraine would look like. And, not to sound like a broken record, but again, everybody kind of expected all of Ukraine pretty much to fall under Russian occupation. That hasn't happened. So that kind of rendered the question a little bit moot, but at the same time, there are significant chunks of Ukraine that have been occupied. And so there is some question then, again, of what Russian occupation in those regions looks like. And at first, it was pretty quiet. There wasn't a lot of reporting going on. And I think for the Russians, their principal approach at first was basically just to elect the municipalities that were already there continue to govern, and to try to get them to cooperate with the Russian military as far as finding saboteurs and implementing new rules and whatnot that would serve to integrate the territory into a either Russian sphere of influence, if not integrated into Russia proper. It's not entirely clear, again, what the Russians had planned for the occupied territories, and maybe that the Russian government itself doesn't entirely know. That wouldn't surprise me either at this point. But to kind of talk a little bit about some of the newer stuff that's been happening in the occupied territories over the past month, there's evidence of resistance cells forming in and around Melitopol, which is in the south of Ukraine. Apparently, they've been staging hit-and-run attacks against isolated Russian units and have been sending information about Russian troop movements to the Ukrainian army. Some civilians also have been doing that, guys who are otherwise not involved in the resistance, but whom have been tracking, documenting, and sharing information about Russian troop movements by way of phone. You know, they've got their smartphone so they can video it. They can submit information to this Ukrainian app that was created specifically so civilians could share information with the intelligence apparatus. One of those guys was actually caught. I was reading an article about that. There's been stories about what the Russians were doing to civilians in northern Ukraine, and one of the guys that they killed, who was a civilian, was a dude who was basically spying on them. You know, he was recording their movements and sharing them. Apparently, he was kind of just running around in the woods trying to observe them, so he was not entirely inconspicuous. But the real thing that did him in is that when they caught him, they found a bunch of stuff that was incriminating on his phone. So, if you're going to spy for your country against an occupying army, maybe delete some of the evidence from your phone. Probably the move there. Maybe not entirely his fault. Maybe he just didn't have time to do it or didn't think of doing it. But regardless, my takeaway from that story is that you should try to make sure there's not incriminating evidence on your phone. And even if you're not actively involved in the resistance, certainly it's still, even then, a good idea to try to make sure there's nothing too incriminating on your phone. Some of the Russians, well, another thing that I read about the Russian occupied territories is that there's been some units that have been raiding houses where there's suspected to be either veterans of the Ukrainian military or possibly people who are working for civil government, or people who are journalists, or people who are working for NGOs or what have you. And when they find those people and raid their homes, they'll dig into their phones and try to find any kind of information that suggests they're working with the army or that they're otherwise anti-Russian. So do try to keep that in mind. I don't know who I'm talking to. I don't think we have like any Ukrainians listening.
Don't have incriminating stuff on your phone, ladies and gentlemen.
Yeah. Just try to be careful and exhibit due caution in that regard. You know, this is a war. There is an occupying army. They've been violent towards civilians. So, just keep that in mind and take corresponding action there. Let's see. That was never proven. What else did we have here? Yeah, there were some more civilians found dead. I think the total number of civilians found dead as of this note anyway, this is probably a week or two old, but the number of civilians that were killed around Kiev Oblast, or more accurately, that were found dead, is 1,084, which feels like a lot. It seems like an unnecessarily large number of civilians to kill, but...
You said specifically around Kiev? Or for all
Yeah,
of
in the area where the Russians had been before they withdrew from the north of Kiev, from the north of Ukraine. Kiev Oblast. It's like the territory in which the city of Kiev is in. Apparently they found 1,084 bodies there. And that same source noted that 50 to 75% of those people were killed with small arms, which suggests executions, basically. Let's see. So continuing in this vein here, let's see, occupied territories. There was a railway bridge in Melitopol, I think. Oh, no, not Melitopol. Well, there was a railway bridge in the south of Ukraine in occupied territory that was destroyed. It was being used to move weapons and supplies from Crimea to Melitopol. That's what it was. And apparently, somebody, we don't know who, blew it up. Maybe Ukrainian special forces, maybe partisans, maybe both. Who's to say? But there has been some sabotage happening in the occupied territories. That's the takeaway. And then there's been stories, I don't know how many have been proven at this point, but there's been allegations that the Russians are trying to conscript men in some of the occupied territories. I'm not entirely sure what the purpose of that is. It seems kind of stupid to an invaded country and then press them into service in your army. That seems like a self-defeating move, because I doubt they're going to be very cooperative.
Mm-hmm.
But that has also been happening, and some of the young men in those territories have been disappearing as a result. Let's see. In other news, the largest city that the Russians were able to take was the city of Kherson. And so the most recent news out of Kherson is that the city government has basically just been dissolved and has now been replaced by a new Russian appointed government that's going to run the city going forward. Let's see. And then another thing they're doing in Kherson, they're trying to replace the Ukrainian currency, the hryvnia. I'm definitely butchering the pronunciation of the Ukrainian currency. I absolutely struggle with the pronunciation of that word. It has way too many consonants for my tongue. But my best guess here is hryvnia. And the Russians in Kherson are allegedly trying to replace the hryvnia as the official currency with the ruble. And from what I read, pensioners and city workers are now being paid in rubles. But I've also read that people who are being paid in rubles are immediately going to the black market and exchanging them for hryvnia.
What
They
is
don't
Hervina?
necessarily, huh?
What is Hervina?
That's the Ukrainian currency.
Got it.
Or that's my personal mispronunciation of the Ukrainian currency. Again, I'm not entirely sure how to pronounce that. But as a small form of protest, people who are being paid in rubles are immediately exchanging them for hryvnia. It doesn't necessarily have a big impact, economically speaking, but it is a way basically to try to undermine the Russian puppet government. It's also not entirely clear that this is going to be feasible, because also the former mayor of Kherson has come out and said that there are no Russian banks operating in Kherson. Right now, it's still the banks operating in Kherson are all Ukrainian, and it's not clear if they can or will accept payment or deposits in rubles or will manage accounts in rubles. So that seems to be another sticking point there. I guess that implies implicitly that the city government is paying people in cash, which I guess maybe is why it's been so easy for them to exchange the money. That would at least explain that. But yeah, it seems, anyway, if these criticisms are accurate representations of what the occupation government is doing in Kherson, that the occupation government doesn't really know what it's doing. It seems like they're implementing some haphazard policies to try to change the currency here, probably more for political and symbolic reasons. If they were actually going to replace the currency, you'd think they would put more thought into preparing financial institutions to try to manage that for them. As is, they don't seem to have done that. And then there are persistent rumors in Kherson of a quote unquote independence referendum. Supposedly, the Russians have been trying to push referenda in some of the occupied territories to get people to vote to become independent and separate from Ukraine. Not a lot of takers. It's been pretty hard to organize that, not least because of the mass protests in Kherson, which have been persistent since the invasion happened. But even beyond that, there's also been a lot of fighting near Kherson in the south of Ukraine between the Ukrainian army and the Russian army. I don't know entirely what the nature of the fighting is. I don't know if the Russians are trying to expand out and the Ukrainians are just fighting them and fighting them to a standstill, or maybe if the Ukrainians themselves are trying to weaken the Russian position there, or maybe even are trying to push them out of the oblast. Details are a little bit scarce in that regard, but apparently, between the fighting and the mass protests, I've read that, well, the rumor anyway, is that the referendum has been canceled because the security situation is just not really sufficient in order to hold it. I guess hypothetically they could just fake it. You know, that certainly wouldn't be beyond their capacity, but it doesn't seem like they're going to make the effort of even doing that at this juncture. But they could in the future, so keep your eye on that. Let's see, I've got some video for you, Neuro. put that in the Discord. I'll just send that to you real quick. Nothing big, just, usual interesting stuff from the conflict. There we go. Let's see, I guess I could post that in chat. I would have to log out, though.
It's video of what?
One of them is a video of the Ukrainian intelligence service conducting raids on suspected Russian sympathizers. It's pretty, I don't know, it's just an interesting video. It's not neither here nor there in terms of substance. And then there was another video where, oh yeah, that's right. So there were some Ukrainians on the side of the road, and they were hanging out when a Ukrainian tank started approaching them. And so, they didn't really respond to it, but then it turned out that it was actually a Russian tank. And so they didn't realize that until the tank itself opened up its main gun on them.
Whoa.
So that's probably not terms of service. I wouldn't recommend showing that on stream, but it's an interesting video for your own consumption anyway. It's not something you see every day, suffice to say. There's been no shortage of videos like that coming out of the conflict.
Yeah, that's a big difference that some people who served in Afghanistan and Iraq had mentioned was they had cameras in those conflicts, but all the footage was pretty grainy and low quality and stuff, and now you have like full HD combat footage from the war, which is pretty gory and alarming, but it does really clearly depict the horrors of war.
It really does. There's been a lot of gruesome stuff out there too. It's pretty wild. It's unprecedented, up to and including the use of drones to take footage.
Mm-hmm.
Some of the drone footage has been just amazing. It's like a RTS vision of a modern war.
Yeah,
completely unprecedented.
Top down is a new thing. It used to be someone has to hold a camera somewhere.
Exactly. So that's a whole new perspective through which to see a war from, and it's just kind of weird, I guess. I also had another one here that wasn't related to Ukraine. Let me see if I can find that for you real quick. You may have already seen it. This was a video of the tornado that blew through Kansas recently.
Ah, we have some people in our WoW guild from Kansas who actually could see it from their house.
Oh, wow, really?
Yeah.
That must have been pretty dangerous.
Yeah. My warrior has a weapon called Thunder Fury, Blessed Blade of the Windseeker, and they were like, Neuro, let me borrow Thunder Fury. I need to handle this tornado.
Yeah, it was pretty dangerous. It blew through what looked like a small town or maybe a suburb. But the wild thing about the video I'm going to send you here is that it was actually taken from a drone.
Mm.
And I think this is probably the best, highest quality footage of a tornado blowing through a built-up area that I've ever seen. I've just never seen anything like it, and it's just really surreal to kind of see it from that perspective. It's almost like something from a movie. Let me see here. Actually, let me just jump in there. All right, hang on. I might drop out for a minute here. I think we're good. Sign up. But yeah. What else did we have here? I don't want to... Oh, we already talked about mobilization. Video. Yeah, I think we're caught up then on Ukraine. I think that's all I had. I'm still doing research on the broader economic impact. It's a lot. It's a lot to kind of review there.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think grain is the big one for the developing world. That's the one that's kind of got them concerned. Because there's a lot of countries, in particular in the Middle East, that are not really well prepared for a disruption in their grain supply. I know somebody sent me a tweet saying that actually there's not going to be any grain shortages because of the war. And that's true. That was an accurate correction. And, I do thank that person for that. But I think they oversold the argument a little bit when they said that there wouldn't necessarily be like a major problem. Because there actually are some countries in the Middle East that do not have a lot of infrastructure for storing grain. They kind of had a just-in-time model for food supplies, which seems a little crazy to me. That seems like a really high-risk thing a high-risk approach to managing your food supplies. But apparently there are some countries in the Middle East like Egypt and Saudi Arabia that had been doing that. So for them, there could be short-term shortages if they're not able to find replacements for Ukrainian grain soon enough, because they don't really have a lot in storage, apparently, from what I was reading. So there could be a problem there. But even if there's not outright shortages, it's definitely going to become much more expensive. That much is inevitable. And that's going to really stress a lot of budgets in the developing world. Because a lot of countries in the developing world actually do subsidizing. They'll subsidize their food supplies, especially staples like bread, for example. That's a super common target of subsidies. And the idea there is just to make sure that food is always affordable for people who might not otherwise have the income to manage like wild swings in the market. But the trouble is that a lot of developing countries don't have like big budgets. So if food or energy, which is used to produce food, becomes a lot more expensive, then those subsidies become prohibitively expensive at the level that they are before the price increases. And so this has been a big problem even before the Ukraine war, just because there had been so much inflation in the global economy. So, even before the war, countries were really struggling with this subsidy problem. And countries were kind of starting to borrow money, were having to make cuts. And now, with food prices going up even more on account of the war, it's an even bigger problem. So a lot of countries are having to relax some of those subsidies and actually increase prices, at least in the short term, in order to try to ease budget pressure. Let's see, password. Trying to log into Twitch here.
If you post it to the Discord, I can post it in chat when I'm not in a game.
I already got it to you, but
cool.
At the same time, I don't want to bug you.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I could just post it myself, and it's easy, so then you don't have to worry about it. But yeah, other than grain, there's also been impact on stuff like aluminum. Aluminum is kind of a weird one. Because that is not something you would expect the Russians to really have a problem with. Because apparently they're like a major aluminum producer. But what I read is that while Russia is a major producer of aluminum, apparently they actually source a chunk of their bauxite from Australia, which I thought was pretty interesting. If you don't know what bauxite is the material that is used to make aluminum. Aluminum is not a naturally occurring material like at all. You take this material that is naturally occurring called bauxite, and you subject it to a extremely rigorous treatment of arc smelting. I think it's called arc something. Basically, it's a kind of smelting that involves an extremely high amount of electricity. And through this process, they're able to refine the bauxite into aluminum of one type or another. And so the Australian government, like a lot of governments in the developed world, has subjected Russia to sanctions. And part of those sanctions involved cutting Russia off from Australian bauxite exports. I'll have to log in with my username. So that's going to have an impact on Russian aluminum exports, and that could have knock-on effects for related industries in the West. Because one of the things that the West has done, and more specifically manufacturers in the West, over the past, couple decades, is that they've outsourced production of certain intermediate goods, like aluminum or aluminum products, like parts for, cars or other vehicles or what have you. And they've outsourced that to various developing countries where it's cheaper to produce that stuff, but where there's sufficient infrastructure and human capital to produce relatively advanced intermediate goods of that nature. Russia and aluminum is a good example of that. So if Russia cannot continue to meet its contractual obligations as far as the export of aluminum, as far as those industries, and any industries that had Russian suppliers in their supply chains are going to have problems. I haven't done enough research on the topic to know which industries are going to be most impacted by that. I would expect German manufacturers to be relatively more exposed in that sense. I imagine the United States is more exposed to, say, Mexican manufacturers, or maybe to Southeast Asian manufacturers. But again, I would have to read more about it to commit more than that. Okay. There we go. Okay, I'm in, finally. You know, sometimes I think about signing in beforehand so I could maybe post stuff without bothering you, but I always end up forgetting because I'm always focused on trying to review notes in a panicked mood generally just before we start. So let's see, since I'm in there, then I can just post some of that stuff.
No combat footage for Twitch chat,
No combat
please.
footage.
Yes.
Okay, I'll just do the Kansas thing. If I can copy it. There we go. Ah,
You
so
are
let's see.
J
Sorry?
1848. That's you.
Yeah, that was the account that I created just for this,
Nice.
which I haven't gotten around to until now, so that's a new thing.
Welcome to Twitch, bud.
I've already been on. I had the different account that I set up so that I could pay you, so that I could
Ah,
access the archive, because that got pay blocked a while ago.
yes. The great DMCA bonkening.
Yeah. Wait, not pay blocked isn't the right phrase. What am I trying to think of?
Paywalled.
Paywall, thank you.
You have to jump over this huge wall of money.
Let's see, what else has been going on? Economic impact. You know, the big thing has been financial. Most of the sanctions have been explicitly financial in nature. You know, full blocking sanctions that have blocked various Russian entities like corporations and government agencies from raising any kind of money in participating countries, you know, like the United States, Europe, etc. And then there's also been sanctions regarding SWIFT. I think everybody knows about that at this point. And then there's been sanctions targeting individuals and individual companies, which go much further in their nature than just the financial sanctions. But yeah, other than that, but beyond that, it's mostly just financial in nature thus far. There's been some export bans, import bans, and some more specific stuff like that. But it seems like they're really focusing on basically the movement of money between Russia and Russian actors and the rest of the world. So they're not really blocking off Russian activity completely, so much as they are inhibiting it. And that itself is having a big impact. Uh, there's also been a big impact in terms of Western corporations voluntarily pulling out of the Russian market. You know, some of the sanctions that have been implemented don't necessarily require them to inhibit their Russian operations to the degree they have been. The issue is that the companies kind of expect that even if the sanctions are not as extensive as they could be at the moment, they will be in the future, and hence it's smart to try to draw down operations now so as to avoid being caught out by a potentially impactful, shall we say, short-term imposition of new sanctions that might severely disrupt their operations. So in that sense, sanctions have a lot of room to grow thus far. You know, right now, the sanctions that have been implemented have not been the most disruptive in the short term. They're going to be more disruptive in the long term. Specifically, things like prohibiting the export of modern manufacturing equipment and other forms of capital equipment. That's going to hurt in the long run, because unless Russian manufacturing can produce their own capital equipment, the quality of the capital equipment they have is going to fall behind their peers in the West. And that's going to make their productivity fall behind, and that's going to be a problem in the long run, because it means that Russian products of one sort or another are not going to be as cost competitive, which opens the door to smuggling of Western equipment, layoffs, and potential issues with subsidies, which are probably going to be required to float Russian manufacturing firms. Russia does have the capability to produce some machine tools, you know, some manufacturing equipment. But the quality has deteriorated over time. It's not really been the main focus of Russian manufacturing over the past couple decades. In general, they've actually become more dependent on the West in this regard over time. And they do still have some legacy equipment that they bought from the West before sanctions were imposed. So it's not as though there's going to be a complete collapse. You know, they can still get some. Oh, hang on. I have to assassinate a spider. There we go. He just rappelled down from the ceiling.
A spider attack. Agent
Nice
Smith
try.
versus a spider. Who would win?
I guess I need to clean my room. Anyway, what was I talking about?
Um, shit. I was thinking about. I
Something.
was
The
thinking.
economy, right? It was, capital equipment. Right, right, right. Okay. Yeah, I was talking about, so in the long term, the quality of Russian manufacturing equipment is going to fall behind peers in the West. And, it could be it falls behind even faster because they're going to be cut off from spare parts and technical support. But it's also feasible that the Russians or maybe the Chinese could produce intermediate parts that could supply them in the, medium term at least. But even so, if over time productivity just isn't going to be there, and eventually they're just going to have to replace that equipment because it's going to get too old, and being cut off from the West, they may not be able to. So at that point, they're going to have a minor crisis. That's still a long ways off, but the fact that it's the expected outcome is going to impact the planning of Russian actors within the Russian economy, and that's also going to have an impact on Russian strategizing. If they think that the Russian manufacturing sector can replace Western manufacturing equipment, maybe it's not a big deal, but I don't think they expect that. In general, the manufacturing sector in Russia has not done well since the collapse of the Soviet Union. They've struggled a lot. I think the most successful parts of the Russian economy have been more agriculture and the services sector, which unsurprisingly are the sectors that probably have the least state intervention as relative to the manufacturing sector. Stuff like the mining sector, oil and gas extraction, stuff like that tends to be dominated by political actors who incorporate the revenue into their patronage networks. And as a result, not as much money is actually invested into modern equipment or into best practices. And as a result, production has tailed off correspondingly. Doesn't really help that a lot of the cheapest sources of oil and gas in Russia have already been exploited. Going forward, they still have a lot of reserves, but the cost of production of those reserves is going to be much higher than the corresponding cost of production in the earlier reserves that they were tapping, which could be tapped more cheaply. So those are all problems for the most important manufacturing industry in Russia, which are the extractive industries. But even amongst the others that produce stuff like defense equipment and whatnot, they're also facing similar problems at this juncture. So again, to kind of bring this full circle, this is an explanation of why they're going to face long-term problems in manufacturing, but not necessarily in the short term. In the short term, again, they still have the equipment that they bought from the West before, and it's still going to last a while longer, at least. There's been a lot of little stuff as far as the impact on daily life, but I haven't really made a comprehensive list of that yet. I did find that there were some Russians who had found a workaround. Amongst those Russians who work online, doing stuff like tutoring or IT jobs, stuff like that, they were able to find a way to get paid. It involved a kind of loophole through a pay service that was offered recently by Telegram, which is a social media website that is popular amongst Russians. So apparently that workaround has been effective for a lot of people involved in the online commerce of one kind or another. Let's see. Was there anything else that we kind of wanted to get to here?
I think we covered most of it. Just like other random silly stuff, not really any other major big ticket items.
I think I had some stuff lined up. Did you hear about the fiber optic cables that were cut in France?
No, why were they cut?
Well, we don't know. It's a mystery, but it was considered a pretty professional act of sabotage. It wasn't just like hooligans or some such. It seems that somebody who knew what they were doing was really trying to significantly inhibit internet traffic in France. So it's kind of considered a major national security issue, from what I was reading. Nobody quite knows if it's related to Russia. Maybe it's like some pro-Russian saboteur who is trying to send a signal, or maybe if it's related to the recent election. There's a lot of people on the far left and far right who were particularly excited, for the election and were correspondingly disappointed by the outcome. So it could be that some of them are kind of taking out their frustrations. Again, unclear who. Could be any. It could be terrorists. Who knows? But it's a point of investigation, and it's definitely one of the more significant acts of sabotage, specifically targeting fiber optic cables. So let's see. There was that. Actually, you brought up the Texas border drama. I actually had a little bit of that in my notes here. There was an ICBM test in North Korea. No surprise. They've been doing that intermittently for the past couple months, trying to scare up some kind of concession from somebody. It's not working, but it was notable from a technical perspective that one of the more recent tests involved the missile flying to a maximum altitude of 6,000 plus miles, which was pretty significant. The North Koreans can't really test their missiles' range very much by actually targeting stuff that's far away, because that would invariably mean shooting missiles over Japan or some such, and that's kind of confrontational and it invites some kind of retaliation. So in order to really kind of illustrate to the world, if not also themselves, just how far their missiles can fly, they'll actually shoot them up rather than horizontally. And the idea is that the further up they can fly, then presumably also there's a corresponding distance that they can fly. And so whenever you hear headlines about this or that North Korean missile flying to a higher and higher altitude that's ever been flown before, that's an illustration from the North Koreans that they can field a missile that has a longer range than they could field before.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, that's a way of trying to implicitly threaten the United States, which historically has been out of range of the missiles the North Korea can produce. But now, more recently, in the past 10, 20 years, they've been producing more missiles that actually can hit the United States. I think at this point it's just Hawaii and the West Coast that they can hit, but 6,000 plus miles suggests that they're increasing the range. So it could be that greater swaths of the United States will be vulnerable to such a missile strike in future. Let's see, there's been a spat of attacks in Israel. There was a bunch of police that were killed in ambush attacks by Palestinian terrorists of some kind. I don't think the Israeli government really released what the motivation was, but I think everybody just assumes that it was Palestinian nationalists of one sort or another. The interesting thing about the attacks has been that the perpetrators have largely been Israeli citizens. Usually when things like this happen, they involve terrorists from the Palestinian territories themselves attacking Jews or Israelis, or maybe Palestinian citizens from the Palestinian territories crossing over into Israel as a part of temporary work arrangements and then committing acts of violence. But generally, the Arab population in Israel has historically been relatively peaceful. It's not to say that they've not been active in opposing the Israeli government's treatment of other Palestinians in the occupied territories, but for the most part, they've been relatively peaceful. But over the past year or two, that's been changing a little bit. There's been a lot more unrest, there's been more violence, there's been more issues like this, and the drama in the past couple of weeks has been the targeting of police, and that's got the country in a bit of an uproar as a result. There was also some drama around the Al-Aqsa Mosque, which is sort of the most important and largest Islamic mosque in Israel, which is located in Jerusalem. There was some attempt by Palestinian protesters to protest at the mosque or in the mosque. I don't exactly remember, but the Israeli security forces had to raid the mosque and drag them out and arrest them, which is not a particularly great look for them. The protesters, to be fair, didn't give them a whole lot of choice, given that they were in breach of some of the rules governing the site, but all the same, it kind of illustrates the degree of discontent on the part of Palestinians within Israel. It seems much greater than it had been. See, we already talked about the Solomons. Yeah, I guess that's about it then.
There was a question about a solar farm in Australia, the largest one that's ever been made or something. Did you hear anything about that?
I don't think so. I think as far as energy news in Australia, the most recent thing I remember reading about was that giant battery thing that Elon Musk was trying to build. He was trying to build some kind of innovative new system. It was like a giant battery plant, and it didn't involve like the production of electricity per se. It was literally just a huge rack of batteries, and they would store power from clean energy sources and then distribute that power later. Something to that effect. I'm probably not remembering the details right. But I do remembering that was located in Australia. So that was sort of the most interesting thing in that vein that I can remember off the top of my head. That said, it doesn't surprise me if they would have built the largest solar panel plant in Australia, because that seems like it would be a good place for it. You know, the weather's pretty good, very hot, very dry, lots of sun, you know, for the solar panels and whatnot. So yeah, makes sense to me on the superficial level. But as far as the details, I'm not familiar. I would have to look it up.
Yeah, I think Australia is one of the countries that ends up with an energy surplus a lot of the time, just because of how much energy they're able to generate with stuff like that.
Is that right?
I think
I hadn't
so.
heard. Energy economics is not really my field. I'm a little behind on it. That's kind of been a more recent development. It's become a lot more popular with the rise of environmentalism and green politics over the past 10 years, but it's a little bit after my time, so I'm not the most up to date on it. I remember reading that Tasmania had a hydroelectric plant. That kind of surprised me. It seems like kind of a small island to have a whole ass hydroelectric plant, but apparently they've got some pretty decent rivers there, or at least some fast flowing ones that facilitate the construction.
Hmm.
Pretty interesting. What did you think of that Elon Musk Twitter thing?
Dude, he is super good at getting himself attention in the news.
Yeah.
Elon Musk says this, he says that, he does this, he does that. Sometimes it amounts to something, other times it's just, I don't know, trying to increase his brand value by being active online.
Yeah.
Definitely of the same vein of like any publicity is good publicity sort of an approach.
Yeah,
I think Twitter for like political reasons and stuff has been a sticking point for a lot of conservatives. They see it as like a leftist bastion, and it's very politically slanted, so they don't feel like it's a fair platform, but it's the main one that people use for social media.
yeah.
So for him to do something like that, it probably scored a bunch of points with them. I'm not quite sure. Maybe chat has
It did. It did.
opinions.
They've been, I've seen some excitement in some of those quarters online.
Hmm.
So they're kind of looking forward to it. They may be disappointed. I don't know how much Elon Musk would necessarily change things if he actually did buy it.
Hmm.
I would add that, the offer to buy is actually credible. Apparently that is going forward. I think I read that Twitter's board of directors did accept the offer. So that seems to actually be progressing.
Hmm.
But it may not be cleared for another several months. So the deal may not be completely finalized until maybe 2023, possibly.
Hmm.
It could be a while. So there's lots of time for people to think about what might change and complain about it and write articles, especially clickbaity articles. But in the meantime, yeah, there's a lot of people on the right who are kind of excited about it because Elon Musk has come out and said that he's a quote unquote free speech absolutist. He thinks that there should be less censorship, less restrictions on content posted on Twitter, and that he's going to try to change the way Twitter is run in order to not only make it more of a free speech bastion, but also to make the algorithms that govern interactivity with Twitter more transparent.
Hmm.
He wants, because he's not historically a big fan of AI, so he kind of wants, allegedly anyway, more transparency in that vein.
Hmm.
But it could be that's all just cheap talk meant to get attention, and that maybe he just wants to buy Twitter because he wants to own Twitter. That could just be the end all and be all of it right there.
I think a lot of people admire him just if they generally admire someone who amasses a lot of wealth. They see him as a success story, so to speak.
Yeah.
So if he's doing stuff and kind of having strong opinions about things and making plays, they like that. He also has like the anti-establishment sort of brand that Trump did. He's not really Trumpist in terms of his rhetoric, but he uses some similar tools in his communication style, especially with social media, where you tweet very wildly without too much kind of curation and filtering and control. You shoot from the hip with how you talk about stuff. You try to hit home with a lot of people's sentiments that they currently have and be an opposing factor to stuff that people currently dislike. So he also like challenged Putin to a fight or something like that, which I think everybody knows that that would never happen because of Putin's security apparatus around himself. But it was still something that, hey, that probably scored points with some people.
Yeah,
And it
it
was really
probably
cheap
did.
to do. Take a few minutes, tweet something saucy, get some fans. There are other people too. I would say I'm more in this camp where I've figured out the pattern of the attention seeking behavior and it seems more or less obnoxious to me rather than impressive. But
Well, he did come out and say that he had Asperger's.
mm-hmm.
So it could just be that he genuinely is antisocial to a degree.
It
So in
could
that
be.
sense,
But
it's a little bit of a
when you're that wealthy, you can have a team of people with you who can kind of offset your weaknesses and that kind of a thing.
that's true, but if you think you're a badass, then why do you need such a team?
Right.
Yeah, if you're a billionaire, why bother? Why not just let it all hang out, so to speak?
Mm.
Yeah, I suspect that's kind of more his perspective on it. He's actually gotten in trouble for his tweeting before. Had you heard of that?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, market manipulation and stuff like that.
hmm
Yep.
Well, there's one specific case in point in which he came out and said that he was going to sell this, that, or the other asset. I don't quite remember what exactly it was. And then he didn't end up following through on it. And
Mm-hmm.
so the SEC got involved with that because it ended up influencing markets.
Mm.
A bunch of people lost a lot of money on it. And he said later that his girlfriend had put him up to it.
It wasn't me.
Yeah, that's an interesting excuse. I don't think the SEC has heard that before. First time for everything, I guess. Yeah, he's had it in for the SEC ever since because they forced him to sign a deal in which he would step down as the CEO of Tesla, I believe, and in which he would have a team of lawyers approve his tweets before he posted them.
Mm-hmm.
There's some debate about whether or not he ever actually implemented that latter point. Some of the more recent tweets in particular suggest maybe he's not actually doing that. But who's to say? But yeah, Twitter should be interesting if it does get bought by Elon Musk. It's not entirely clear what he'll do. Maybe he does end up, lifting a bunch of restrictions. I think the major restriction everybody is kind of most watching right now is the former president, Donald Trump, because of course he was banned from Twitter on
Mm-hmm.
account of the January 6th shenanigans
Mm-hmm.
and some of the statements he made with regard to those. So it could be that Elon Musk buys Twitter and then lifts that ban, at which point Donald Trump is back on Twitter. And that could mean a return to some of the previous Trump dominated news headlines that sort of dominated 2016 to 2020, which I'm not particularly eager for because I had to pay attention to that. I try to follow the news
Mm-hmm.
so that I can, be ready for the segment and also for my own edification. But man, having to pay attention to that kind of stuff is just draining. I was not sad to see him leave Twitter. But that said, maybe it doesn't pan out that way. It could be that maybe the news agencies have kind of learned their lesson and will pay less attention to Donald Trump, even if he does return to Twitter. That was sort of one of the complaints that I read a lot amongst journalists after the 2016 election. There was kind of a lot of introspection after the election, and a lot of journalists kind of came to the conclusion that they'd been irresponsible in giving Donald Trump as much free attention as they had. And so it could be that if Donald Trump does return to Twitter, that they may not actually pay nearly as much attention to him as they did before, specifically for that reason.
Hmm.
But that remains to be seen. Something to keep an eye on. Something to make 2023 exciting.
It's certainly going to be dank. We don't live in the most stable era, but it's certainly a very saucy time where there's plenty of stuff to talk about.
Oh, yeah. Always more. Well, I guess I would add here, since I imagine we're kind of nearing the end, uh, if people are interested in hearing about the economic impact on of the Ukraine conflict on Russia, Ukraine, Europe, and the broader world, what specific category of topic would you be interested in? Like what particular aspect of the impact are you most interested in, if you're interested in it at all? Because I've been trying to kind of summarize all of it, but it's just so big. There's so many secondary effects and tertiary effects. It's kind of hard to pin down. So if there's one area I could focus on, that would make it much easier on my end.
Mm-hmm.
There's a lot of linkages there.
Specificity helps. We can
Yeah.
narrow it down. It's easier to talk about. The less it's narrowed down, the more vague and generalized you have to be.
Yeah, that was one of the problems I had when I was trying to research the trade war between the United States and China starting in like 2018. I kept thinking, okay, I should just look at individual products that are affected by the tariffs and see what kind of changes the tariffs will have on the prices of those goods and what effects those changes will have, what kind of knock-on effects that'll have on individual industries, and then in turn, what kinds of secondary effects it'll have on the broader economy and on other industries.
Mm-hmm.
And that plan went south really quick when it became apparent that the number of products involved ranked in the thousands.
Ooh.
It just wasn't really feasible to go through all of them.
Mm-hmm.
And so that made it really difficult because I really wanted to kind of look at them in detail and kind of trying to break down some of the specifics. But as was, I ended up having to just look at aggregate data, which was being reported by think tanks and stuff, and trying to make inferences from that. So this isn't quite as complicated. Russia's economy is much smaller, but they have a lot of little bottlenecks. Because again, like I said before, a lot of developed countries and companies therein have outsourced certain critical manufacturing capacities to Russia, among other developing countries, in order to try to exploit lower costs. So trying to understand all those little bottlenecks is sort of the tricky bit.
Mm-hmm. Well, cool. If people have any other questions or comments and so on, feel free to ask them in the YouTube comments or share your perspective. One of our favorite things is to hear about what's happening in other countries that we have not visited or don't live in. So if you have a take from where you live and some perspective, we welcome that, as this is a group conversation. We're basically just trying to figure out the world together.
We actually have somebody from Liechtenstein listening.
Nice.
That's always a weird one for me. What are the odds?
Fairly high. I would guess many of them speak English, and the EU community in StarCraft is pretty high population. We have people from Thailand in the chat. Our usual suspects from the US and Canada, of course.
Yeah, got one from New Zealand. Got 3 from Russia.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you for being patient with me. I'm sure it's weird listening about the Ukraine conflict from some American on Twitch. So certainly feel free to offer feedback and corrections. I would certainly appreciate the Russian perspective.
Mm-hmm.
One from Switzerland, Bulgaria. I think I saw... no, I guess I didn't. Maybe he's gone. I thought I saw him earlier. We had that guy from Curacao who pops up. That's always an interesting flag to see. Well, anyway, thank you for having me on. It's always a pleasure and a privilege.
Heck yeah. You definitely carried the conversation today. I got a new keyboard made, and man, it is brutal trying to relearn all of your game mechanics with a game as fast-paced as StarCraft 2. The keys aren't spaced quite in the same way, so I'm more or less trying to rebuild my muscle memory. Not quite from scratch, but pretty close to that. So I've had a very big downswing where my rating has gone down a lot. And I had a couple opponents today during Agent Smith who were like, are you smurfing or something? Like, why is your MMR so low? You're normally higher than this. And I understand that they're asking that question in good faith, but it does feel like being kicked when you're down. I've had this kind of thing happen before where I have a downswing for some reason. Maybe I haven't been able to practice as much, or I'm trying new strategies or that kind of a thing. So it's a familiar feeling. It definitely stings, but it's a good ego deflation. I think it's healthy every now and then to like distance yourself from some of the attachments to your rank. I usually have a shiny Grandmaster border around my portrait, and I have a Master's one now, so very humbling, which is not fun, but it's likely healthy.
Yeah, a little recalibration now and again.
Yeah.
Not a bad thing.
Well, cool. Before we wrap up, I wanted to issue you a similar challenge to last week. You thought you were going to get out of this by doing the good nights. No, sir. Outside is good. And it's springtime, so it's probably not too hot yet.
It was a little warm today, but yeah, it's still pretty tolerable. So yeah, it's manageable.
Yep.
And I could use the exercise for sure,
Chat.
especially after that whole ass pizza.
Yes, definitely. You have to atone for the pizza that you had.
Exactly. And I got to walk that off.
Well, cool. Appreciate you coming on as always. And we will see you on the next episode of World Discussion with Agent Smith.
Yeah. Yes, sir. Thanks again. See you next time.
Smith. Smith. Smith.